I spent most of my career as a ranger trying to keep people safe from things they thought were harmless. Noise, light, food scraps, all of it mattered in the backcountry. Most campers didn't realize how thin the line was between a harmless night under the stars and a real problem that could unfold in the dark without warning. I learned early on that fear wasn't the enemy. Complacency was. And on that particular night, the group that tested my patience more than anything else was a pack of frat boys who thought the forest was their personal party ground. I remember the heat of the day still hanging in the air when they arrived. They came piling out of two SUVs, loud from the moment the doors opened. Music blasting, beer cracking open before they even signed in. Their campsite wasn't far from a few families and an older couple who came every summer for quiet. The moment the sun went down, the noise exploded. Shouting, laughter, banging on coolers. It was the kind of noise that carried through the hills in sharp waves, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible for anyone else to settle into the night. I was on patrol with Jim, another ranger who'd been around even longer than I had. We heard the noise from the trailhead before we even saw their site. When we finally reached them, I gave them the standard talk, the same talk I'd given dozens of times. Noise traveled. It bothered other campers. It attracted wildlife. They nodded with drunk smiles and promised they'd keep it down. We turned away, knowing damn well it wouldn't last. It didn't take 20 minutes before the sound came roaring back through the trees, even louder. It wasn't just music this time. It was hooting, yelling, someone slamming the car doors like drums. We headed back, each step heavier than the last. When we reached them the second time, I didn't bother sugarcoating anything. I made it as clear as possible that this was the last warning. The area had mountain lions. They were quiet animals by nature, but loud, chaotic noise sometimes drew their curiosity. People called them ghost cats because they could move inches from you without you hearing a twig snap. I didn't dramatize anything. I just told them what was real. Loud noise at night wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. And if they heard anything outside the tents, the worst thing they could do was step out. We left them with that. But as we drove back to the station, Jim glanced at me with that look he always had when an idea hit him. By the time we pulled in, he was already heading for the interpretation center. He wanted to make a point, something they wouldn't forget. And honestly, after the way they were behaving, I didn't feel like stopping him. The lion pelt from the old display was rough and worn, but it still held its shape well enough. It smelled like dust and the faint musk of an animal long gone. The night vision goggles were a leftover splurge from the previous year's budget, rarely used, but perfect for this kind of job. We prepared quietly, checking the batteries on the PA, grabbing flashlights, making a plan without a single word spoken between us. By the time we headed back out, the frat boys were finally tucked away in their tents, the noise having dropped off suddenly. I assumed they'd either passed out or decided to follow the warning. The campsite was dark when we approached. Only the faint glow of a dying fire and the shape of their tents stood in the stillness. We moved on foot, slow and quiet, letting the night soak around us. I remember the crunch of dry needles under my boots and how loud they felt even though we were barely making a sound. Jim started making the fake tracks first, pressing the big carved molds into the soft dirt. I held the light low so he could see, watching the clean prints appear one by one. Huge paws, long claws, spaced just right to look like something heavy had been circling through the trees. Then we set up the pelt. We propped it up on a cluster of thin sticks angled to create the outline of a crouching animal. From far enough away, in the beam of a flashlight, it could look like a real cat frozen mid-step. I tested the angle, shifting left and right, making sure the shadow would move if I moved. It looked good, too good, honestly. Even I felt a tiny prickle of unease looking at it in the darkness. Jim moved back into the trees and turned on the PA. The first call echoed low and distant, a deep, rasping cough that bounced around the quiet woods. It was subtle at first, almost natural in sound. Then it grew louder, closer, the way a curious cat might approach something new. I could see the faint shapes in the tents begin to shift. They were awake. They were listening. I pulled the Jeep forward slowly, keeping the headlights off. When we reached the edge of the campsite, I stepped out with the mag light in my hand. I kept my pace fast but controlled, sweeping the beam across the trees until I aimed it at the pelt. The moment the light hit it, the shape came alive in the shadow it threw. It stretched across the ground, long and fluid, like something stepping toward the tents. Even from outside, I could hear the rustling panic inside the nylon walls. Bodies shifting fast, the faint sound of someone trying not to breathe too loudly. The PA calls grew sharper, like the cat was circling. I didn't have to say anything. Fear was doing the work on its own. Then Jim broke into the scene with frantic shouts through the PA, escalating it just enough to push their nerves to the edge. I didn't need to see the boys to know what they were thinking. They were trapped in thin tents with something they believed was hunting around them. Everything went silent for a moment, and then we made it worse. We cut the lights, killed the PA, grabbed the pelt, sticks snapping under our feet, and bolted into the Jeep. We drove off fast enough to make the tires kick up dirt behind us. The forest fell back into real quiet after that. No fake calls, no lights, just the slow settling of night returning to normal. At sunrise, the first light came creeping through the trees. I was already up, drinking weak coffee and waiting to see how long it would take to move. When it didn't show up by 7, I knew the fear had worked deeper than we expected. It wasn't until well after 8 that I saw the first head poke out of tent. Then another. Then another. They stood there, pale and stiff, scanning every corner of the campsite like something might still be crouched nearby. When they finally stepped out and saw the enormous paw prints all around their tents, the reaction was instant. Jaws dropping, hands on heads, staring around like they had slept in the middle of a hunting ground. They didn't pack quietly. They didn't talk. They didn't even look at each other much. They just gathered their things fast and left before the heat of the morning settled in. I watched them go, their SUV engines fading down the road. And as I stood there with my empty coffee cup, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. Not because we scared them, we scared people all the time during training scenarios, but because the truth was the silence of the woods after they left felt like the forest breathing again. The lesson stuck with me long after I left the job. Sometimes the only way to teach people the reality of the wild was to show them a version of it sharp enough to stay with them. Nothing we did that night was supernatural or impossible. It was just the forest, the dark, and fear filling in the empty spaces. And if that meant they never forgot to respect the quiet of the woods again, then maybe it was worth it. Even now, years later, I can still picture the look on their faces when they saw those tracks. Pure, simple fear. Not the kind that comes from monsters or ghosts. The kind that comes from understanding for the first time how easily something real could have been standing right outside their tent while they slept. I was camping on the West Coast, in one of those quiet campgrounds that sit a little too far from the highway and a little too close to real wilderness. I had chosen it for that exact reason. I like the idea of being away from noise, away from city lights, away from the constant pressure of people. But I also had back problems, so no matter how much I love the idea of camping, I couldn't handle sleeping on the ground. I had the back seat of my car converted into a sort of bench bed. It wasn't comfortable like a real bed, but it was flat, padded, and better than waking up in pain. I had worked out a whole system for privacy. I kept dark covers over the windows, tucked into the edges, so nobody could see in, even if they pressed their face right up to the glass. That night had been normal. It was cold enough to make the air sting, but not cold enough to worry about frost. I had fallen asleep to the distant sound of waves, only hearing them when the wind shifted the right way. There were a few other campers scattered around, but they were the kind who went to bed early and didn't make noise. By the time midnight came, everything felt dead still. I didn't mind that. Silence helped me sleep. Sometime early in the morning, when the sky was still black and the air felt heavier than it had hours before, I woke up to a sound that didn't make any sense. It wasn't a howl or a snap of branches or anything sharp and obvious. It was a low, rolling rumble, a deep scraping. I grew up in the suburbs, not in the wild, so the only thing my brain could compare it to was a shopping cart being pushed across a rough, broken parking lot. The kind with chunks of gravel sticking out of the concrete. That uneven grind of metal wheels hitting every little imperfection on the ground. It had that same dragging rhythm, that same hollow shake, like something heavy rolling over something even heavier. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I stayed half asleep for a few seconds, listening without really reacting. Then the noise got closer. It passed right behind the car, close enough that I felt the sound as much as heard it. It made my stomach tighten because nothing in the woods should sound like that. Animals made noises, sure, but nothing I knew of made a rumbling vibration like rolling metal. Before I could even pull myself fully awake, the entire car jolted. Not a soft nudge, a real bump. Hard enough that the car moved several inches, hard enough that my elbow smacked against the inside of the door. I felt that jolt deep in my chest, the kind that hits you before your mind can catch up. My body rushed with panic, so fast it felt like heat spreading. I didn't know what was outside. I didn't know if it was an animal or something else. All I knew was something big had hit the car and kept moving. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap. I grabbed the inside zipper and tried to pull it down, but that zipper wasn't meant to be quick. It caught on the corner of the fabric. Then it stuck for a second. My hands were shaking enough that I fumbled with it more than once. Every second felt too long. Every sound outside felt louder because I didn't know what it was. I finally managed to pull the bag open enough to sit up. My knees hit the back of the driver's seat, and I pushed myself upright, ripping the rest of the bag free enough to move. I leaned forward, trying to see through the covered windows, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything until I lifted the fabric. But I didn't want to lift it. There was a strange fear in me that whatever had bumped the car might still be right there, pressed against the glass. After a few seconds, when the rumbling sound faded away into the distance, I worked up the nerve to move the window cover on the side, facing the forest. I peeled back one small corner and looked out. Nothing. No shadow. No shape. No movement. The trees stood still, dark and tall, with only the faintest breeze making the branches shift. I moved the cover a little more. Still nothing. Not even a sign something had brushed against the car. I checked again and again, certain I must have missed something huge, but there was no clear trail, no broken branches, no sign of anything. The bump had been real. The sound had been real. But now there was only silence. I didn't get out of the car. I stayed inside with the doors locked until the sky turned a pale blue and morning finally arrived. Only when I could see the ground clearly did I step outside. The cold morning air rushed in, waking me up completely. I checked the car body first. There was a smudge on the back door, wide and faint. Not a clear paw print or anything identifiable, just a smeared mark like something large brushed against it. I walked around slowly, looking for tracks, but the dirt in that area was a strange mix of soft powder and dry needles, and nothing stood out. No prints, no deep impressions, no path through the bushes. It was like whatever had been there walked across the absolute perfect ground to hide its passing. The campground host later told me it was probably a large animal. Maybe a bear, maybe an elk, maybe something that had wandered close without meaning to do anything. They said big animals sometimes make strange noises when they move across gravel or through old campsite areas with leftover junk under the dirt. They didn't seem worried, but they also couldn't explain why it sounded like rolling metal. And they definitely couldn't explain why something would hit my car hard enough to shake it, then vanish without leaving prints in soft ground. I stayed the rest of the morning in a sort of uneasy haze. Part of me kept replaying the moment the car moved. I knew I hadn't imagined it. The jolt had been strong, and the sound had been loud enough to tear me out of sleep immediately. Something heavy had walked close enough to push the car. Something big enough to make the entire frame shift. I never figured out what passed by me that night. I never found tracks or a clear answer, even though I kept looking longer than I should have. Maybe it was just an animal with massive weight and strange footsteps. Maybe something dragging something behind it. Maybe something walking on ground I didn't understand. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible, just something real that I didn't recognize. But the part that stays with me, the part that still sinks into my mind whenever I think about camping again, is the moment right after the car moved. The quiet. The way the sound faded so fast, like whatever it was moved on without any hesitation, not even caring that it had bumped into something bigger than most things in the forest. That quick disappearance made it feel even larger, like it had somewhere it needed to be, and I was only in the way. The truth is I probably will never know what walked past me that morning, and that's the part that keeps it lodged in my memory even now. I heard it. I felt it. It was real. Something big enough to move the whole car walked right beside me while I was trapped in a sleeping bag, unable to see anything. And by the time I sat up, it was already gone. I still camp. I still sleep in the car. But every now and then, if I wake up in the early morning darkness, I wait a few seconds before moving. I listen. I let the silence settle. And I always hope I never hear that same rumbling again. I lived on the outskirts of a national park in a cabin that felt like it belonged to another century. The drive from the main road to the property was 4 miles of uneven dirt, deep ruts, and thick trees that pressed in so close they almost touched the sides of my truck. The place had no plumbing, no power, and no real sense of safety. It sat right where the park's boundary line cut into a huge piece of private land. Once you were on that driveway, you were in the middle of nothing but trees, brush, and silence, so complete it almost felt staged. My roommate at the time was interning with the Park Service, and he thought the whole situation was charming. He was a city kid who liked the idea of roughing it, even though he never seemed to understand what it actually meant. My first few weeks, they were quiet. I spent my evenings reading by lantern light, listening to the insects beat against the windows, and trying to get used to how dark true darkness really is. Out there, the night wasn't soft. It wasn't peaceful. It was thick and heavy, and it made you feel small. The trees blocked the moon most nights, and the cabin's thin walls let every sound travel right through. I tried to tell myself the silence was good, that it meant nothing was nearby, but that wasn't true. The woods never stayed silent for long. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was lying in bed. I remember thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a wild pig. The sound was steady, slow, almost human, but I forced myself not to overthink it. The property was huge. It wasn't strange for wildlife to be close. The problem was how it would stop. Every night, around the same time, the footsteps would come through the brush, move around the cabin area, then stop in places where the growth was thick enough that nothing should have been able to stand still without making some kind of noise. No rustling, no snapping branches, no breathing. Just silence that hit too suddenly. On the third night, the sound came closer, pausing at one of the cabin's windows. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the dark pressing down on me. The cabin didn't have a locking door. The owners claimed they didn't need one, said no one wandered that far up. They didn't want me to install anything, either. They liked it old, untouched original. That thought nagged at me the whole night. The door didn't lock, and someone or something was walking around right outside. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was the wind. But wind didn't walk. Wind didn't pace. Wind didn't move like a person deciding where to step next. My roommate slept through everything. He never seemed bothered, probably because he had never learned the difference between normal forest noise and the things that shouldn't be happening. He said my mind was playing tricks on me because it was so dark, but my gut wouldn't let it go. The dread grew every night. It felt like something was watching us from the trees, like it knew the house was easy to get into. I finally started sleeping in my car. I parked it far away, an acre or more from the cabin, because I didn't want whoever or whatever was walking around to know where I was. I'd parked behind a group of large pines where the branches hung low and thick, hoping it would hide me well enough. The first night I slept there, I felt foolish. By the second night, I didn't feel foolish anymore, because the footsteps followed. It didn't make sense. I had moved far from the cabin. There was no reason for anything to walk out that far, especially in a direction that led to nothing but overgrown brush and sloped ground. Yet, sometime past midnight, I heard them again. Slow, measured, coming from behind the trees. I stayed absolutely still. I didn't even breathe right. My hand was shaking against the steering wheel as the sound came closer and closer, then stopped somewhere behind my car. I didn't move again until the sun came up. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed my things the next morning. My roommate laughed when I told him I was done living there, said I was being dramatic. But I couldn't stay. Something was wrong with that place, and I didn't need proof carved into me to understand it. The footsteps were too controlled, too deliberate. Not animal, not random. And the feeling that grew in my stomach every night wasn't imagination. It was instinct. A few weeks after I moved out, my roommate called me. He didn't believe anything I had said, but he told me he'd been robbed. Someone had come into the cabin while he was gone and taken a bunch of his gear. He thought it was a fluke until it happened again. The second time, more things were missing: tools, food, personal stuff. That finally made him put up motion-triggered cameras around the property. The cabin didn't have power, so he used battery ones that saved the footage to an SD card. He checked them every few days. One morning, he sent me a message. No jokes, no mocking, just a short line telling me to call him. When he answered, he sounded different, quiet, shaken. He told me the cameras had caught someone. Not wandering animals, not some lost hiker. A man who carried a long rifle, who hiked up the property at night and hid in the bushes near the cabin. He stood there for long stretches of time, not moving, just watching. Sometimes he sat down. Sometimes he walked in a slow circle around the place. On one clip, he appeared exactly where I used to park my car to sleep. The man knew exactly where to stand, so he wouldn't be seen from the windows. He knew how to move without making extra noise. He had probably known we were there long before we realized anything was wrong. My roommate moved out a few days after that. The cabin sat empty. The owners never admitted anything strange ever happened, but they took down the listing soon after. To this day, the part that stays with me the strongest isn't the robberies or the rifle or even the footage. It's those nights when I lay in my car thinking I was hiding, listening to footsteps stop right behind me in the dark. Knowing now that it was a man out there, close enough to touch the car if he wanted to, watching the same way he watched the cabin. It makes the woods feel different even now. Not haunted, not supernatural, just real in a way that's worse. Because people can be much quieter than animals, and much more patient. I went out to Colorado in the winter of 2010 because I felt like I needed to be alone for a while. I had just finished a wilderness leadership class, the type where they talk a lot about confidence, decision-making, and trusting your senses. I thought I had learned enough to handle myself out there. I wanted to test that idea, to see how I acted when nobody else was around, when every sound and decision fell entirely on me. I heard about some hot springs on BLM land near the Colorado River that were only accessible in winter. In the summer, the snow melt raised the river high enough to drown them completely. But in the cold months, they came out again and stayed warm no matter how freezing it got outside. That sounded like the kind of quiet place I needed. When I arrived, there was nothing around except open land, long stretches of bare dirt, frozen plants that bent under their own weight, and the distant rush of the river. The BLM worker who watched the area noticed me pulling in. She drove up in her truck and told me to write the date on my windshield once a week so she knew I was alive. She said it like it wasn't a big deal, but when I parked my car and looked out at the empty land, I understood why she said it. Out there you could disappear without anyone knowing for weeks. There were no rangers passing by every couple of hours, no crowds, no houses, nothing. Just you and whatever lived on the land. The hike from my car to the hot springs was about 4 miles, and in winter that meant 4 miles of cold, crunching snow and uneven ground. I carried everything on my back. The air felt sharp in my lungs, like it was cutting me from the inside. The river was always somewhere in the distance, low and cold, and the wind kept pushing against me like it wanted me to turn back. By the time I reached the hot springs area, the sun was dropping behind the cliffs, and everything felt even quieter. I set my tent close to the edge of a 40-foot cliff that dropped straight down to the river. It wasn't the kind of place most people would choose for a campsite, but I had this plan in the back of my mind. If a bear came at night, and I had no chance, I figured maybe I could jump into the river and then get to the hot springs before getting hypothermia. It was a stupid plan when I say it out loud now, but when you're alone for days and thinking about what could happen, your mind builds these strange escape routes that seem logical at the time. Every night, I thought about bears. They should have been asleep for the winter, but I knew that if a bear wasn't sleeping, it wasn't sleeping for a bad reason. A hungry bear in the winter doesn't want berries or grass. It wants meat, and I was the only thing out there that fit that description. I had bear spray, but I also knew that using it inside a tent would just blind me, choke me, and leave me on the ground coughing while something tore through the fabric. So each night, I lay still and listened to every noise. The sound of the river below, the wind slapping the tent, the tiny crack of a branch somewhere in the dark. I never slept well. I drifted in and out for minutes at a time, never fully asleep and never fully awake. One early morning, long before sunrise, I woke up to a sound that didn't fit the normal pattern of the place. It was heavy, solid, like something big was moving through the snow. I felt the weight of each step through the ground. At first I tried to tell myself it was the wind again, or maybe a tree shifting under ice, but then I heard the breathing. Slow, deep exhales, almost like short grunts. It wasn't far away. It was right outside the tent. I froze. My body just shut down like it didn't know how to move anymore. The air inside the tent felt trapped and tight. I could hear the thing sniffing, pulling long breaths through its nose like it wanted to understand what I was. I thought about the cliff behind me. I thought about how I would even get out of the tent, how much noise the zipper would make, how fast something could charge if it heard me. And the breathing kept getting louder, heavier, closer. The ground sounded like it shook with every step. I didn't move an inch. I felt sweat on my neck, even though the air was freezing. My sleeping bag felt like a trap. I tried to slow my breathing, but it was impossible. All I could think about was how soft the tent wall was and how a claw could slice right through it like nothing. I kept listening, waiting for that split second where everything would explode into motion. Then I heard more footsteps, more than one animal, at least two, maybe three. They were moving around, circling almost, and the noises weren't like anything I had heard from bears on videos or in training. There were lighter steps mixed with heavy ones, weird short grunts, almost like something communicating but not in a way I understood. I stayed completely still until the sounds began drifting away from the tent. Not gone, but moving. After a long moment where I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing, I finally pushed just the very top of the tent open, slow enough that it barely made a sound. Cold air rushed in and hit my face. I looked out and saw a herd of elk walking across the snow, their shapes huge and dark in the early morning light. They weren't even that far away. I watched them for a while as they moved together, their breath rising in the cold air. All that fear I felt made sense in my body, but looked ridiculous from the outside. It was the most scared I'd ever been while camping, and yet the truth was simple. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything trying to hunt me. It was just wildlife moving through its own home, doing what it always did, and I happened to be in the middle of their path. But the fear didn't disappear after that. If anything, it changed shape. I realized that you don't need anything supernatural or violent for the wilderness to scare you. Sometimes just being alone out there, miles from help, with nothing but thin fabric between you and the night, is enough to make your mind believe that anything could happen. When I finally packed up and hiked out weeks later, I felt lighter. Not brave, not fearless, just more aware. The land didn't care that I was scared. It didn't care that I was alone. It just existed the same way it always had. And somewhere in the middle of that cold season, on the edge of that cliff, with the river running below me and elk walking around my tent in the dark, I understood something simple and clear. Fear doesn't mean danger, and danger doesn't always announce itself. But respecting both is what keeps you alive out there. I used to be part of a youth group very similar to the Scouts, and because of that I spent a lot of time in the woods. Most strange things I saw out there were easy to explain once you calmed down and thought about it. But one night still sits in the back of my mind in a way nothing else ever has. I was one of the leaders for a group of 8 to 10-year-old kids, and we were on a camping trip in a place we had never used before. The area was huge, far bigger than anything we normally used, so big that we couldn't explore all of it before the kids arrived. Usually we like to walk every trail and check every risky spot, but that weekend it just wasn't possible. We knew we were going in blind and hoped the terrain wasn't hiding anything strange. Every camp had what we called a night game. It was a simple idea. The kids had to walk through the woods, complete tasks, collect items, and we hid in costumes to scare them. It was supposed to be fun and harmless, and usually it was exactly that. That night we all put on our masks, smeared some dirt on our faces, and spread out in the trees near the checkpoints. I took a path that led away from the camp and into a darker section of the woods. I remember the first thing that hit me was how still it was. No wind, no small animals rustling, just a thick kind of silence that sat heavy in the air. Even with years of experience outdoors, something about it made the back of my neck feel tight. I kept moving between the tasks the kids had to reach, trying to find good hiding spots. At one point, I stepped into an open stretch of forest where the ground was mostly flat and there wasn't much undergrowth. It looked perfect for running and jumping out to scare someone. The problem was that there was nowhere to hide except behind the trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight. If I did, the beam would give me away instantly because the woods were unusually dark that night, almost like the darkness thickened the farther you looked. While I was crouched there waiting for the next group of kids, I saw a dark shape move past me. Just a shadow, but it was about my height and moved fast. I snapped my head toward it, ready to see one of the other leaders messing around, but the space between the trees was empty. When I lifted my flashlight for a second, there was nothing but the pale trunks glowing in the beam. I told myself the darkness was playing with my eyes. It wouldn't be the first time. As the game neared its end, I saw that shadow again. This time it didn't move. It stood near a tree, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. I squinted, thinking one of the others had stopped to catch their breath. I started walking toward it, planning to tell them the game was almost done and we should head back soon. When I raised my flashlight, the beam hit something I still remember too clearly. There was a person standing there. The outfit didn't make sense. It looked like a torn burlap sack hanging off their body, and their head was wrapped in several white plastic bags tied together. The whole shape of them looked wrong, like the bags pulled the head upward in a strange stretched shape. Something in me tightened instantly, a cold feeling that filled my stomach with a heavy weight. At first I tried to tell myself it was one of the leaders pulling a prank, because the night game always encouraged stupid surprises. But nothing about it added up. The person wasn't moving except for this slow, steady sound. It took me a second to understand what the sound even was. It was like someone knocking wood with something solid. When I moved closer, maybe 10 meters away, the light caught the movement. The sound was the person smacking their head into the tree over and over. The plastic bags shifted with each hit. Their hands were curled in strange, stiff positions, and the person was barefoot. Their legs and arms were covered in dried mud, cracked and flaking. There was no reason for anyone in our group to be out there like that. No costume we had looked like that. No one could have changed into something like that without someone else noticing. The longer I looked, the more everything inside me screamed that something was wrong. The woods felt smaller. The silence felt thicker. My breathing was loud in my own ears. Then the person stopped hitting their head. Their entire body went still. Slowly their head turned toward me. Even from that distance, I could feel the way their attention locked onto me. It didn't feel like a joke or a prank. It felt like walking into the wrong place at the wrong time. When they took the first step toward me, something in my mind broke loose and told me I needed to run. Not walk, not think, just run. I turned and sprinted through the trees, trying not to trip, trying not to slam into a trunk. I could hear fast footsteps behind me, closing the distance. I didn't dare look back because I knew if I turned my head even slightly, I would crash into something, and that would be it. My lungs burned, and I could feel branches scraping against my arms, but I kept running. When I broke through the tree line and saw the lights of the campsite, I didn't stop moving until I reached the main area where all the leaders were gathering. Every person who could have been dressed like that was standing there already. None of them were out of breath or covered in mud. None of them had the time to get there before me and change. Everyone looked normal and busy packing up the props from the game. I didn't say anything at first because I didn't want to sound insane. Eventually I mentioned it, pretending I thought it was one of them trying to be funny. They looked at me like I was the one trying to scare them. They brushed it off and kept doing their tasks, so I kept quiet after that. The next morning I went back with one other leader to check things out. I still told myself it was probably just some local idiot messing around. Maybe someone drunk or high. Maybe some guy who lived nearby and decided to mess with us for fun. Anything that made sense was better than the feeling I had when I saw him the night before. We walked all the way to the tree where I had seen the person hitting their head. The forest looked normal in daylight, calm, harmless. When we reached the tree, the quiet changed again. Hanging there was a dead rabbit, skinned, decomposing, nailed into the wood. The smell hit before the image did, and it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The skin was missing, the body stiff, insects starting to gather. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. We reported it to the police. They came, looked around for a few minutes, rolled their eyes a bit, and said it was probably just a prank from some local teenagers or another scout group messing around. They didn't seem surprised and didn't stay long. They left it at that. Nothing else strange happened for the rest of the trip, and we finished the camp like normal. But that night stuck with me. I still think it was probably a prank or some local with a messed up sense of humor. But the way he moved, the plastic bags on his head, the dried mud, the silence of the woods, the sound of his footsteps behind me, and the dead rabbit nailed to the tree made it feel like something far worse than a simple joke. I still can't explain why he was out there or what he wanted. All I know is that I was lucky I didn't freeze or fall when I ran. And even now, years later, when I walk through woods at night, I sometimes feel the same tight feeling in my stomach, the same sense that there might be someone standing too still between the trees, watching without making a sound, waiting for someone to notice them. I was camping alone with my dog along the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, the kind of place where the air feels sharper at night and the silence carries farther than it should. I had picked a small clearing just a few feet from the edge of a slope that dropped down into a long stretch of pine and dark open space. I liked being out there because the sky always looked bigger and the dry smell of the pines always made me feel calm. I set up my tent before the sun went down, gathered a pile of wood, and started a fire once the shadows stretched out long between the trees. By the time it was fully dark, the world outside the range of the fire looked like one continuous wall of black. My dog lay next to me with his head resting on his front paws, half asleep, but still alert the way dogs always are in the wild. For a while it was peaceful. The only sounds were the fire cracking, the occasional wind slipping through the branches, and my dog shifting around on the dirt every now and then. I kept poking at the fire with a stick just to keep the flames high enough to see the bushes around us. The temperature dropped as the night settled in, and that cold made every sound feel sharper and every shadow feel heavier. Then I heard something behind one of the bushes to my right. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffle like something brushing against dry leaves. I didn't react at first because noises like that happen all the time out there. Animals move around, branches fall. The woods are never completely quiet. But when I glanced at my dog, he wasn't looking at the fire anymore. He was looking straight at the bush where the sound came from. His ears were up, his whole body stiff, and instead of barking the way I expected him to, he started to whimper under his breath. That was the first thing that made me feel uneasy. My dog rarely acted scared of anything. He wasn't small, and he usually barked at every little thing he didn't like. But that night he pressed himself a little closer to me, and the sound he made wasn't his normal warning sound. It was the sound he made when something was wrong. I try not to think too much about it. I leaned forward, tossed a small piece of wood into the fire, and kept it burning bright. I scanned the dark line of trees, but I couldn't see anything past the firelight. After a few minutes things went quiet again, and I thought maybe it had been a rabbit or something else small. My dog finally settled down a bit, though he still kept flicking his eyes toward the dark. Then another noise came, this time from a different bush on the other side of the camp. It was louder, like something heavier pressing down on dry needles. My dog reacted instantly. He got up fast, tail low, ears flat, and walked straight to the tent. He scratched at the door in a way that wasn't asking. It was begging. He wanted to go inside now, and he wanted me to go with him. That was the moment the fear really sank in. I felt it spreading through my stomach, That kind of feeling that tells you something bigger than you is close, something watching you from a place you can't see. I grabbed a couple of small rocks and threw them toward the dark area where I heard the sound. I didn't hear anything run or move. Nothing reacted at all. The silence after the rocks landed was worse than the noise itself. My dog kept scratching at the tent, and I could hear his breathing get faster. I didn't want to sit out there alone if he was that scared. I tossed 2 more pieces of wood onto the fire, making the flames jump up higher, hoping the light would push whatever was out there back into the trees. I didn't look too long into the darkness because every time I did, it felt like something was staring back at me, even though I couldn't see a thing. I climbed into the tent with my dog, zipped it shut, and tried to calm myself down. The fire outside made the tent glow slightly, and that faint light felt like the only thing keeping the night from swallowing us whole. Inside the tent, I could hear my heartbeat more than anything else. My dog curled up against me, so tight it felt like he was trying to press himself into my ribs. Every small sound outside made him stiffen, but nothing came close again. The night stretched out slow. I stayed awake for what felt like hours listening for footsteps, breathing, anything at all, but after a while the fire burned lower and the glow faded. I eventually fell asleep without meaning to, still fully dressed, still tense, but too tired to keep my eyes open. The morning light came in soft and pale, and the forest looked calm and harmless again. My dog was already alert and staring toward the bushes. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, like something had moved through the camp while we slept. I walked slowly toward the area where we heard the noises. The dirt around the bushes was disturbed, and when I crouched down I saw clear tracks in the ground. They were large, round, and unmistakable. Mountain lion tracks. They circled around the entire camp, from one side to the other, close enough that if I had taken even a few steps past the fire the night before, I would have walked straight into the dark with a predator nearby. Seeing those tracks made the fear I felt the night before hit me again, but stronger, because now it was real. My dog knew it before I did. He knew something big was out there watching us, moving slowly and silently around the fire while we sat there, thinking it was nothing. I stood there for a long time looking at the ground, thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong if I had gone toward the noise with a flashlight or tried to scare it off in the dark. The lion must have been watching us the whole time, waiting, circling, deciding whether to come closer or not. I packed up camp as quick as I could after that. I didn't want to stay another minute, knowing how close that animal had been to us while we slept with nothing but a thin layer of tent fabric between us and the night. Before I left, I looked back at the place where my tent had stood and pictured those tracks circling around me while I sat by the fire thinking everything was fine. It was a quiet reminder that the wild doesn't care how calm you feel or how safe you think you are. Something can be watching you without making a sound, close enough to touch, and you won't know until the morning comes and you see the prints in the dirt. I'm glad I stayed by the fire. I'm glad I listened to my dog. I'm glad I didn't go walking toward the bushes that night. Because if I had, I know for a fact I might not have made it back to see daylight at all. I was at Philmont Scout Ranch for a backpacking trek with my crew. Every crew starts out with a ranger who hikes with them for the first couple of days to make sure they know the basics. How to read a map, use a compass, filter water, handle emergencies, and pace themselves over the rough terrain. Once the ranger was satisfied that the crew could manage on their own, they would head back to the nearest staff camp or pickup point. Our ranger was a tall, wiry guy with weathered skin and eyes that looked like they had spent decades staring into the sun. On our second night, after dinner, he started telling us about one of his hikes back after leaving a crew, and I could tell he was about to recount something unforgettable. He had left his crew near a backcountry campsite, and he decided to take a shortcut along a game trail he had spotted on his map. Game trails are usually narrow paths carved out by deer, elk, or other wildlife over time. They're often easier to follow than cutting through the dense forest, especially in the late afternoon when light is fading. He told us he liked to follow them because they gave him a sense of direction without constantly checking his compass. But that day, the trail was quieter than usual. There was no wind to rustle the leaves, and no birds or squirrels were scurrying about. Even the smell of pine and dirt felt unusually strong, almost overwhelming. As he walked, he kept an ear out for wildlife. The woods were alive with distant sounds, the crackle of twigs, the occasional rustle of leaves, but mostly just silence. He was moving at a steady pace, scanning the forest floor and the underbrush for anything out of place. At first, he thought the rustling in the brush was a deer or a coyote, but then he felt it before he saw it. He described a sudden pressure, almost like a shadow pressing against the back of his legs. When he turned slightly, he caught a glimpse of a mountain lion. The animal moved with a fluid, controlled grace. Its coat was tawny, blending perfectly with the underbrush, and its eyes were sharp, focused, and almost unnervingly calm. It didn't growl or hiss. It didn't crouch like it was ready to attack. Instead, it simply followed, padding along the trail behind him, silently, almost like it was studying him. The ranger froze for a moment, heart pounding, aware that any sudden movement could trigger a predatory instinct in the animal. Then something strange happened. The mountain lion brushed up against his legs, rubbing like a house cat might do when it wants attention. He froze completely. He could feel the animal's muscles pressing briefly against his legs. The ranger explained later that when a mountain lion does this, the instinctual fear response is so intense that it can make someone involuntarily defecate and urinate. His heart was hammering, adrenaline rushing through his veins like fire. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, run, or fight, but his mind told him to stay still, to not provoke it. For what felt like an eternity, he stood frozen, hoping against hope that the lion was not planning to attack. The animal moved its head along his side, sniffing, then nudged his hip lightly. The ranger said he could feel every second stretching on forever, every heartbeat loud and chaotic. Finally, after what seemed like minutes, but was probably only a few, the lion turned and padded a few steps away. It stopped, looked back at him with those sharp, unblinking eyes, and then, almost as casually as it appeared, vanished into the forest. The ranger's relief was immediate but tempered by a lingering unease. He didn't rush, didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he took slow, deliberate steps, keeping his eyes and ears open for any sign of the mountain lion returning. He moved along the trail, scanning the forest floor for tracks, noticing the faint imprint of paws pressed into the dirt. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, and every snapping twig or falling leaf made his stomach twist. He stayed alert, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, until he finally broke out of the thick forest and onto a ridge where the trail merged with a wider, more familiar path. By the time he reached his staff camp later that evening, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. He cleaned himself up as best he could, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. That night, as he sat by the campfire, he could still feel the weight of the encounter pressing against his chest. He said it was the kind of experience that leaves a permanent mark, not in the form of injury, but in the form of an awareness, a respect for the quiet power of nature and the unpredictable behavior of wild animals. When he told us the story, he didn't dramatize it with monsters or ghosts. He didn't exaggerate. Every detail was precise. The way the mountain lion moved, the scent in the forest, the way his body reacted before his mind even processed what was happening. The ending, he said, was simply survival, returning safely to the camp without provoking the animal, learning a lesson in patience, caution, and respect. For the rest of our trek, every time we followed a game trail, I couldn't help but think of him, imagining that quiet, powerful presence somewhere behind us, hidden in the forest, and I understood why every ranger respected the wild in a way that we as scouts were only beginning to grasp. By the time he left our crew, we had all gained more than just survival skills. We had a deeper understanding of the forest's rhythm, of the tension between human presence and wild animal instincts, and most importantly, of the fine line that separates a calm encounter from danger. That story stayed with me long after the trip ended. Not because it was terrifying in a supernatural sense, but because it was real, visceral, and completely plausible. The ranger returned safely to camp, and we finished our trek with a new sense of awareness and a respect that would stay with us for life. I work in a remote desert park where most days feel quiet in a heavy way, like the land is holding its breath. Long stretches of dirt road, hot air that shakes above the sand, and a kind of silence that almost feels alive. By the time I got hired, the story I'm about to tell had already happened, but the rangers who lived through it still talk about it in the same low, tight voice like it got under their skin and never fully left. Hearing it from them and then standing in the same place as myself changed the way I look at this place. It made the desert feel less empty and a lot more watchful. The campground where it happened sits far out on the edge of the park, a spot we almost never visit during summer. That season is our off time, when the heat is too brutal for visitors, and even we try not to go out unless we have to. Most years, the only things that move around are vultures, snakes, and the wind that blows fine dust against your legs like tiny needles. The sun doesn't just warm things out here. It cooks them. It melts plastic, fades paint, warps metal. Every abandoned thing left in this desert looks older than it should, like time moves faster here. According to the rangers who were on duty that day, the plan was simple. They just needed to do a quick patrol to make sure the campground hadn't been damaged by storms or used for illegal dumping during the summer lull. They were tired, hot, and ready to head back to the main station. But when they rolled into the last loop of the campground, they saw a shape in one of the sites that didn't fit. It was a car, burned black and collapsed in on itself, sitting at an angle like the ground underneath it had softened. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. The desert has a habit of turning strange things into scenery. So at first they thought maybe someone set it on fire months earlier, and it had just been sitting there unnoticed. But when the maintenance ranger walked up to it, he felt the heat still clinging to the metal. Not fresh flames, but not years-old ashes either. It was recent, maybe a day or two. The ground around the car was scorched in a circle, charcoal spreading into the sand. The air smelled like burnt rubber and something else underneath it, something that stuck to your nose and tasted metallic. They backed up and called the sheriff. That's the rule out here. We do the finding, they do the dealing. The sheriff's department is used to weird things near the border. Strange cars, abandoned trucks, people who pass through the desert and leave things behind that you don't want to think about. But when the deputy arrived and looked into the driver's seat, he froze. Even the rangers who told me the story said they had to look twice before their minds would accept what they were seeing. There was a body in the seat, burnt so badly that the shape barely looked human, except for the head and torso. No arms, no legs, just a blackened frame slumped forward. The fire had eaten everything around it, including most of the interior, but something about the way the limbs were gone didn't look like the fire had taken them naturally. The cut of it, the edges, the missing chunks of seat foam. It was the kind of thing you don't want to look at, but can't stop staring at. The sun glared off the metal roof and made the whole scene shine like it was still burning. The sheriff didn't stay long. He looked around the site, walked a few slow circles, then shrugged it off as a suicide. They picked up the body, hauled the car away, and closed the case. That was it. No digging, no searching for tire tracks, no checking for footprints, no real explanation. Just a shrug and a quick exit. The desert has a way of swallowing things, and out here, people seem willing to let it. When I started working at the park months later, the other rangers told me the story on my first long patrol with them. They pointed out the turn where the road gets softer, the wash where storms chew away the dirt, the stretch where they realized something was wrong. When we reached the campground, everything looked normal. 10 empty sites, a set of rusted metal picnic tables, a dry pit toilet that creaks when the wind hits it. But standing there, knowing what had happened, changed the way the place felt. The air felt heavier. The shade under the ramadas felt colder. Even the silence felt different, like it was listening. The fire had scorched the ground so deeply that the sand still looked darker in that one site. I crouched down and brushed my hand over it. The ash had mixed with the sand and hardened in places, forming thin black plates that cracked under my fingers. Nothing had grown back there. Not even the tiny hardy weeds that managed to survive everywhere else in the park. It was like the ground refused to heal. For weeks after hearing the story, I caught myself avoiding that campground. I told myself it was because it was out of the way or because there was no real reason to check it during the quiet months. But the truth was it bothered me. The details didn't fit together cleanly. The fire, the missing limbs, the way the sheriff brushed it off immediately, the way the rangers still went quiet when they talked about it. I kept thinking about the position of the body in the car, the clean cuts where the arms and legs should have been, the strange stillness in that sight. It didn't add up to a simple suicide, no matter how hard I tried to force it. What bothered me most was how quickly everything was removed. The sheriff's department had the car gone by the afternoon. By the next morning, the campground looked almost untouched. No tape, no markings, no sign that something horrific had happened there. It was like they didn't want anyone looking too closely. Maybe they were tired of dealing with drug traffic. Maybe they didn't want attention on something they couldn't easily explain. Or maybe they knew something we didn't and wanted it gone fast. A few months later, I finally forced myself to patrol that campground alone. It was late in the day and the light was turning orange, making the desert look even more empty than usual. I parked in the same loop, walked the same path, looked at the same blackened patch of earth. The air was completely still. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just me and the faint smell of old burnt metal that still lingered in the sand. Standing there, I felt something settle in me. Not fear exactly, more like a clear understanding. Out in the desert, things happen that will never make sense. People come through here in desperation or panic or with secrets bigger than their own lives. Some of them leave traces behind. Some vanish completely. And sometimes the desert decides what gets noticed and what gets forgotten. The ending to this story isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It's just the truth of what stayed with me. When I look at that site now, I don't think about ghosts or anything supernatural. I think about how small humans really are out here, how easy it is for something terrible to happen with no witnesses, and how quickly it can be erased. The rangers who found that car still don't know what really happened. I don't either, but I know one thing with complete clarity now. The desert doesn't hide things because it's mysterious. It hides things because most people don't bother to look long enough to see what's right in front of them. And out there in that silent heat, I realized that whatever happened in that car wasn't an accident and wasn't something the fire alone could explain. It was something done by someone for reasons we will probably never know. That truth sits with me each time I drive past that long, empty road. And it reminds me that the scariest things in this place aren't the stories people make up. It's the things that actually happen and the way they can disappear into the sand like they were never there at all. I had been hiking in Andorra with a friend on what was supposed to be a simple day out. We had been following a marked trail since early morning, moving from open meadows into thicker forest, feeling that mix of tired legs and fresh air that makes hiking feel worth it. At some point, without realizing it, we drifted off the trail. It started as a small mistake, just stepping around some fallen trees and rocks, but then the markers stopped appearing. We kept walking downhill because downhill often meant towns or roads, and we thought eventually we would hit something familiar. We didn't know it yet, but we had crossed into Spain. We didn't have a proper map, only vague memory of routes we had looked at online before starting. The slope felt endless, and the ground under us kept changing from soft dirt to loose gravel and then back again. We reached another trail eventually, one that seemed clearer and more traveled, but we had no idea where it went. The sun was still up, but I could feel the hours slipping away. My friend looked tired, and so was I, but I pushed on because stopping in a place we didn't recognize felt worse. After a while, I saw a man far ahead on the trail. He had 2 golden retrievers bouncing around him, tails up and moving fast. He carried climbing gear slung across his back. His steps looked confident, the kind of walk you see from someone who knows exactly where he is. I felt relief straight away, because people like that, people who move with purpose, usually know the trails. My friend sped up a little, and I forced myself to keep pace. I kept watching the dogs weaving in and out of the trail, taking short little runs ahead before circling back to him. Their smooth golden coats caught the light and were easy to spot even far away. We rushed down to catch up. I remember the air smelling like pine and warm rock, and the sound of our footsteps growing louder as we tried to close the distance. When we finally reached him, I felt sweat running from my head down my back, and my legs burned from the push. He seemed friendly, relaxed, and he looked younger than I expected. He stopped for only a few seconds, then kept moving at a steady pace. The dogs brushed past my legs, gentle and curious. They kept running small circles around us, sometimes trotting ahead, sometimes coming behind us, always full of energy. My friend and I stayed close, following the man as he explained where we were and how far we had to go to reach a town with a hotel. He said it was a long walk, around 12 kilometers, but there was a smaller town about halfway there. He mentioned that he had parked his car in that smaller town and that he could drive us the last part if we wanted, though he seemed in a rush. I felt a huge wave of relief, knowing we weren't stuck in the middle of nowhere. We walked together for a while, pushing through a section where the trail narrowed and the ground sloped sharply on one side. The man stayed balanced and light on his feet, while my friend and I slowed down. The dog stayed close to him, sometimes darting behind us, sometimes running ahead. I kept thinking how grateful I was that we met him, because wandering without a map had started to feel like a stupid risk. My legs were shaking a little from tiredness, and I noticed my pace dropping even though I tried to keep up. The man kept moving like he was late for something. My friend gave me a tired look that told me neither of us could match his speed for long. The trail ahead curved sharply to the right, bending around a thick cluster of tall bushes and rock. He passed that bend before we did, and for a moment we couldn't see him or the dogs. My friend and I kept pushing, expecting to catch sight of them again as soon as we reached the bend, because the trail beyond it ran straight for a long distance. When we got there, I felt something strange in my stomach. The trail was empty. There was no man, no dogs, nothing ahead but a long stretch of dirt running downhill. I looked left and right, scanning the tree line, expecting to see movement or hear the sound of dogs somewhere. There was nothing at all. The whole space was silent except for the breeze running through the branches. I kept walking slowly, staring up the trail and down the slopes, waiting for some hint of where he had gone. There were no side paths, no clear breaks in the bushes, no fresh prints leading off into the woods. It didn't make sense. He had been just ahead of us, only a minute or two away. He couldn't have run so far that fast, not with two dogs. My friend whispered a worried thought that he might be hiding somewhere, and the idea stuck in my head immediately. My breathing grew tight, and I kept looking behind us, half expecting someone to step silently out of the trees. We kept walking, and the trail felt longer, heavier, as if the air itself had grown dense. Every sound in the woods made me tense. I kept checking the ground for signs of footprints or paw prints, but the dirt was dry and scattered with fallen needles, making it impossible to read. The more time passed, the more I wondered if he had ever been heading to a car at all, or if he had planned something else. The idea of someone ducking off the trail and waiting for us came back again, and each time I felt my hands clench harder. We didn't talk much, just focused on walking, trying not to look too panicked, moving at a steady pace toward the town he said existed. The sky shifted to late afternoon, shadows stretching over the trail and across the rocky hillsides. My shirt clung to my back, and my legs felt heavier with each step. The fear didn't go away, but it changed. It became a steady awareness, a constant checking over the shoulder, a constant listening for anything behind us. But nothing ever came. No footsteps, no dogs, no voice in the trees, nothing at all. When we finally saw rooftops through the trees, the relief hit me so hard I almost stumbled. The town was small, quiet, with only a few houses along a narrow road. I scanned everywhere for the man's car or the dogs, expecting to see them waiting or walking around. There was nothing. We moved through the town and then kept going, following the road toward the bigger town he told us about. We reached that hotel hours after we first saw him, exhausted and sore, but safe. Later that night, lying in the small hotel bed, I tried to make sense of it. There was no way he could have sprinted so far with two dogs in that short amount of time. There was no turnoff he could have taken without us seeing. There was no sound, no sign, nothing that explained how he vanished. Maybe he simply moved faster than we realized. Maybe he jogged or took some hidden shortcut that people familiar with the area knew. Maybe the dogs were trained to stay close and silent. But deep down I felt something colder, something that stayed with me long after I got home. It was the simple fact that someone had been right in front of us, someone who knew we were tired, lost, and far from help. And then in less than 2 minutes, he was completely gone without a trace. And all the way down that trail, through every empty stretch of forest, I kept waiting for him to appear behind a tree or step out from a clearing. But he never did. In the end, nothing happened to us. We reached the hotel, rested, and got home the next day. But the memory stayed sharp. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was something far more real and far more disturbing. It was a reminder that in the wilderness, people can do strange things, disappear without effort, and leave you wondering what they wanted and why they moved the way they did. It was the uneasy truth that sometimes you cross paths with someone whose intentions you will never understand, and you only realize how vulnerable you are long after you're safe again. I was camping deep in the Everglades, far enough from a main road that I couldn't hear anything but insects, distant splashes, and the slow, steady breathing of the swamp around me. I had parked my old convertible on a patch of slightly higher ground, the kind of spot that looked dry only because everything else was wetter. Nights there always felt heavier than anywhere else I had been. The air didn't just sit on you, it pressed you down like the humidity had hands and weight. Because of my back problems, I slept in the car instead of tent. It wasn't the smartest idea to trust a cloth top in the Everglades, but when your spine hurts every time you try to lie flat on the ground, you make do with what you have. The night had that deep darkness that only places far from people get, the kind where even the moon seems swallowed. I lay in the back of the car, trying to get comfortable, feeling the thick air cling to my skin. I had the windows open because December didn't mean cool air in the swamp. It just meant the mosquitoes were slightly slower. I could hear every shift of the water around me, the croaks, the buzzes, the rustles from ground-level plants. I started drifting in and out, waiting for my back to settle into the least painful angle. At first, I thought the sound was just a strange breeze brushing the top of the car, but there was no breeze that night. It was completely still. Then I heard the weight. A little thump, then another, slow steps pressing onto the cloth roof above me. My brain needed a second to figure out what it was. Whatever it was walking across the top of the convertible and walking like it thought it owned the place. Raccoon, I told myself, trying to stay calm. Probably a big one. Maybe bigger than usual. Maybe way bigger than usual. I could actually feel the cloth dip slightly with each step, like the animal was testing the fabric. I imagined claws hooking into it, teeth trying to tear through. I pushed upward with my hand to spook it off, feeling the roof press back against my palm. The weight scurried off, thumping across the top and disappearing into the night. I waited a few minutes, trying to breathe slow again, but before long the same soft but heavy footsteps returned. Same rhythm, same boldness, like the raccoon had decided it wasn't done with me or my car. I pushed again. It ran off again. This little battle went on longer than it should have. Long enough for me to get annoyed, then tired, then uneasy. When it finally stopped coming back, the silence felt too empty. I tried to close my eyes again, but my brain didn't settle. I stared at the dark fabric above me, expecting the next set of steps at any moment. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been 10 minutes, or it could have been an hour. The swamp messes with your sense of time at night. I heard a rustling sound near the window, a soft scrape that was too close to ignore. I opened my eyes, already tense, and when I looked toward the front of the car, my stomach tightened. The raccoon was sitting in the driver's seat. He sat there like a person, like he had just finished adjusting the mirrors. Big, round body, hands resting on the edge of the seat, head turned just enough that I could see his eyes staring over the backrest directly at me. In the faint light from the moon and stars, his eyes reflected a dull, flat shine. Not supernatural, not glowing, just a normal reflection of an animal's eyes. But in that moment, they felt too focused, too aware, too calm. I moved fast, more from instinct than anything else. The raccoon scrambled out through the open window, vanishing into the palmettos so quickly it didn't make sense how quiet it was. I sat there breathing hard, feeling sweat already spreading across my back. I didn't want to lie down again. I didn't want to close my eyes. The idea of that raccoon sitting a foot from my face while I slept made my skin crawl. I got out and walked to the bathroom area near the campground. The night felt different outside the car. Colder, even though it wasn't actually cold. The trees around me looked twisted, not from shape, but from shadow. Anything could hide behind any trunk, and you wouldn't know until it was already too close. I splashed water on my face, tried to calm down, tried to convince myself that it was just an overly bold raccoon, nothing more. By the time I got back to the car, the tiredness had settled deep into me. I managed to fall asleep for a few hours, though it wasn't comfortable, and every tiny sound woke me up just enough to keep me on edge. When the sun finally rose, the swamp looked harmless again. That was the strange thing about the Everglades. In daylight, it felt open and peaceful, almost friendly. I stretched, stepped out of the car, and walked around to the back to check on my stuff. That's when I saw the torn bread wrapper lying under a nearby tree, flattened and empty, the plastic covered in bite marks. My loaf of double fiber bread, 18 slices, was gone. I checked the storage well behind the back seat where I had put it the night before. The cloth top folded down into that space, leaving just enough room for dry storage. The raccoon must have slipped inside the car while I was at the bathroom, dug around until he found the bread, and dragged the entire loaf out into the trees. Standing there in the humid morning air, the sky already bright, I pictured that raccoon sitting somewhere in the brush, licking crumbs off its paws like it had just won a prize. 18 slices of dense, high-fiber bread in one sitting. That was more fiber than any creature needed in a single night. I couldn't even imagine what that would do to a raccoon's stomach, especially a raccoon bold enough to walk across the roof of a car, climb inside it, steal food, and stare me down without a flicker of fear. The more I stood there, the more the whole night felt strange. Not supernatural, not unreal, just uncomfortable in a way that sticks with you. Being alone in the Everglades teaches you that the animals there aren't afraid to cross lines. Some of them don't care where you sleep, what you think is your space, or what you consider safe. They'll step right into it if they feel like it, and you won't know their intentions until they've already acted. I packed up my things slowly, checking every corner of the car twice, looking for scratches, looking for anything else missing. As I drove out, the sunlight filtering through the trees almost made me forget how uneasy the night had felt. But every time I thought about the weight on the roof, or the raccoon sitting upright in the driver's seat with those calm eyes, or the empty bread wrapper under the tree, I felt the same cold feeling in my stomach. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest moments aren't dramatic or violent. Sometimes they're simple, quiet moments when you realize an animal has no fear of you at all. And in a place like the Everglades, that small detail is enough to keep your mind awake long after the night is over. I left that morning with the sun warming the hood of my car and the swamp slowly fading behind me. But the memory stayed sharp, a reminder of how thin the line is between comfort and unease when you sleep in a place that belongs more to the wildlife than to you. I went out there thinking it would just be a quiet trip in the mountains, nothing more than 2 nights of cold air, open sky, and long rides through land that barely looked touched by people. My cousin worked with the Forest Service, doing hydrology work in the Montana and Wyoming border area, and she spent most of her time riding into places you couldn't reach without a horse and a lot of patience. I always liked hearing her stories about the snow runoff tests, the stream samples, the way the valleys looked in the mornings. So when she asked if I wanted to tag along for a short ride along, I didn't think twice. I packed my gear, kept everything light, and tried to act like I knew what I was doing even though I didn't. She helped me strap everything to the saddlebags, checked everything twice like she always did, and we set out early the first morning. The first day felt perfect. The air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe it. And every time we climbed another ridge, the view hit me so hard I had to just sit there for a second. Wide open sky, long dark tree lines, scattered patches of wildflowers stretching as far as I could see. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. We made camp near a small stream with water so clear I could see every stone at the bottom. I slept with the smell of pine all around me and the quiet hum of night insects mixing with the sound of the water. I remember lying there thinking I didn't want to go back to anything else after this. It felt like a world tucked away from everything. The second morning we packed up, checked the horses, and started riding again. It was cooler that day, the kind of cold that sits against your skin even when the sun is out. A few hours passed without anything unusual, just the steady rhythm of the trail and the sound of hooves on dirt and rock. At one point, she motioned for me to follow her off the usual route. She didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. I just followed her through a small line of trees, then into a narrow ravine that barely looked big enough for two horses. The walls rose slowly on each side until we were surrounded by slopes of broken rock and old fallen timber. The more we rode, the quieter everything felt. Even the birds seemed to stay away from that place. It took almost 2 hours before we reached a tiny clearing, almost circular, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the sky. We tied the horses to a down log, and I walked behind her through a thin wildlife trail. The ground felt soft under my boots, almost too soft in some places, like the soil had been disturbed recently. I carried the little rechargeable radio she always used, the kind with a crank on the side and a small lantern built into it. She kept telling me this thing was basically indestructible, good for any emergency. I had no idea why she wanted me to bring it, but I didn't think about it too much. I just followed the narrow path until it opened up again, and that was when I saw the coil of wire coming straight out of the dirt. At first, I thought it was just old equipment someone forgot decades ago, but the wire looked clean. No cracks, no sun damage, no rust on whatever metal was part of it. It looked like something you'd see running inside the walls of a house, just left out in the middle of nowhere. I crouched next to it and touched it. The plastic coating felt cold. It ran along the ground for a bit, then climbed up over a branch, then dropped again, then twisted around some rocks like someone had intentionally arranged it that way. The whole path of the wire felt too deliberate to be random. I kept following it, stepping slowly, pushing branches out of the way, keeping my eyes on the thin line of colored plastic. After a minute or two, the path widened into a strange little pocket in the trees, and there in the middle of it sat a school desk. Not broken, not weathered, just sitting there like someone put it there yesterday. Metal legs, fake wood top, the same kind every kid sat at growing up. On the side of the desk was an outlet. 2 sockets screwed into a small metal plate, mounted flush against the wood. The wire ended right at the back of that outlet. There was no sign of a generator, no battery box, no solar panel, nothing. Just this desk and the outlet and the wire stretching back into the trees. I walked around it a few times trying to make sense of it. The ground around the desk looked disturbed, like someone had dragged it there or set it down recently. But there were no footprints, no tire marks, no tracks of any kind. It was like it had just appeared there without anyone ever touching the ground. I handed over the radio and watched as the cord snapped into place in the outlet. The second the plug hit the socket, the whole radio lit up. A sharp burst of static exploded from it so loud it echoed off the trees. I felt my stomach drop. That meant the outlet was live. Something was feeding power into that wire, underground or from somewhere we couldn't see. I stood there trying to breathe slowly, but my chest felt tight. My mind kept racing through explanations, but none of them made sense. There were no buildings for miles, no roads, no sign of any work crew. Nothing that would explain why anyone would run power out here, much less mount an outlet on a school desk in the middle of untouched forest. The radio stayed loud, the static constant, the signal strong. That meant the power wasn't just weak or fading. It was steady, like whatever was supplying it was close or well maintained. That bothered me even more. I kept looking back at the path we came from, half expecting someone to step out, but the forest felt empty. Too empty. Even the wind seemed to stay still. We didn't talk. There was no need to. Both of us understood how wrong it was. I kept waiting for some sign that it was old research equipment or a leftover installation from decades past. But it all looked too new, too intentional. The desk had no rot. The outlet was clean. The screws weren't rusted. When I touched the metal plate around the outlet, it even felt slightly warm. We left it exactly the way we found it. The wire stayed in place. The radio cord came out cleanly. The static cut off fast, like someone had flipped a switch. I walked back through the trees, feeling like something was watching, not in a supernatural way, just the way you feel when you know someone else has been there recently and you have no idea where they went or if they're coming back. We rode the same way we came, slow and quiet. Every sound made me jump. A branch snapping, a bird taking off, even the horses shifting made my nerves spike. By the time we reached our planned route again, I felt drained, like the whole day had pushed all the energy out of me. We camped that night, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that desk sitting in the trees, waiting for something I didn't want to imagine. The next morning we rode back toward the main trailhead. I didn't look back once. At the station, I asked around carefully, trying not to sound strange, but nobody knew anything about any old installations, any old research sites, any wiring in that part of the forest. They said the area was cleared years ago, no active projects, no hidden equipment, no remote power sources. Nobody had any reason to be out there. I didn't tell them the full story. I just let it drop. Some things are better left alone. In the end, the part that stuck with me the most wasn't the desk or the outlet or the fact that it was live. It was the realization that someone had to be maintaining it. Someone had to check the wiring, make sure the line stayed underground, make sure the outlet kept working. Someone had gone into that forest and set it up for a purpose I couldn't understand, then walked away without leaving a trace. And the worst part was knowing that if we hadn't taken that random turn, if we hadn't gone 2 hours off the main route, I never would have known any of it existed. I still think about that sometimes. How much else is hidden out there? How many strange things sit quiet in the trees where almost nobody ever goes? I haven't gone back to that region since. Not because of anything supernatural or dramatic. Just because that place reminded me that even in the most beautiful parts of the world, humans can leave behind things that feel wrong in ways nature never does. I love the mountains, but after seeing that, I realized I didn't understand that land as well as I thought I did. And whatever was powering that outlet, I decided I didn't want to understand it. I wanted to stay far away from it and let it stay hidden where it belonged. I still think about that couple more often than I want to admit. It has been years now, but the memory sits in the back of my mind like a weight that never shifts. I was a ranger in the Southeast back then, young enough to still feel sure about most things, old enough to have seen a few situations that stayed with me. But nothing stayed the way that day did. It taught me something about silence, about how people make decisions long before anyone around them notices, and how you can walk right past the middle of a story without understanding what you're looking at. I noticed them on a Monday morning. The park was quiet, the kind of slow day where the air feels thick and the trees barely move. The couple stood out because they didn't move with the easy sort of aimless wandering you usually see from visitors. They walked with purpose, but also a kind of uncertainty, like they were chasing a memory that kept shifting out of reach. They were older, maybe late 60s or early 70s, dressed like people who had packed carefully, who planned things out and didn't rush. They spent the day moving along the river trails and the small lookouts, never staying long at any one spot. When they left, I didn't think much of it, but they came back the next day, and the next, and the next. They always looked at the same areas, always checked the map mounted by the visitor center, always carried the same worn photographs. Even from a distance, I could tell the edges had been handled a lot. I guess they were looking for a place they remembered from years ago, and I assumed they'd eventually find it or give up and head somewhere else. I didn't think anything strange was going on. I just kept noticing them the way you notice something that doesn't quite line up, but doesn't seem dangerous either. It was maybe the fourth day when I walked past them near the river and saw the man holding out one of the photos. I could see the background in the picture. I recognized the shape of the rocks, the bend of the water, the shadow line across one side. I knew roughly where that was, a place a little off the easier route, a spot people still visited sometimes, but not the way they used to. Trails shift over time. Erosion changes things. A place people once stepped to easily might sit farther off from the marked path now, half hidden by growth. They looked tired from searching, the kind of tired that isn't just from walking. So I told them I could show them where I thought the spot might be. I drove them in one of our vehicles along the fire road, then hiked with them the rest of the way. It wasn't a long hike, but it was uneven and they moved slowly. Still, they didn't complain. They didn't seem stressed. They just kept looking around with a kind of quiet focus. When we reached the bend in the river, I saw the man stop first. He didn't say anything. He just stared. Then the woman touched his arm. They stood there together, side by side, looking at the place. It matched the picture almost perfectly when you look from the right angle. The rocks were worn down, the waterline a bit different, but the bones of it were the same. I stayed long enough to be sure they were comfortable, then headed back. It was late afternoon by then. The sun was starting to drop behind a ridge, and the woods were getting that deep orange color that always made the place feel calm. I drove back to the entrance station and settled in for the end of the day. Nothing unusual happened, but as the light started to fade, I felt something I couldn't explain. A kind of pull on my stomach that told me not to assume anything. I tried to brush it off. People do strange things at parks. They lose track of time. They stay longer than they mean to. Still, I watched the road for their vehicle, expecting it any time. The sun went down. The other visitors left. The noise of the day died, but their car never came through. I knew they hadn't passed without me noticing. Their vehicle was older and had a distinct sound. Around closing time, something inside me pushed hard enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I radioed it in, told my assistant to stay on the lookout, and drove back up the fire road with my high beams cutting into the woods. The hike back, down to the river, felt heavier in the dark. The trees were thick, the air still. When I stepped out onto the riverbank, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the water sounded. Usually that spot had a steady, soft rush, but that night it sounded distant, almost muffled. I moved my light across the ground, over the rocks, across the bank. And that's when I saw them. They were lying on their sides, facing the water, curled into one another in a way that made it clear they had done it intentionally. The man's arm was around her. Her head rested against him. They looked peaceful in a way that didn't match the sharp cold feeling running through me. I could see the empty pill packets beside them. I could see the small bag they must have carried the entire time. I didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. I knew. I called it in. The rest of the night went the way those nights always go. Police, lights, questions, the slow mechanical steps of handling something no one could fix. I answered what I could. I went home feeling like there was a ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop. Later, the police told me the part one hadn't known. The woman had terminal cancer, the kind people don't come back from. They had come out east because this was where they got engaged a lifetime earlier. They had wanted to go on their own terms, and they had wanted to do it in the place that tied the story of their life together. They hadn't asked anyone for help because they didn't want anyone to be caught up in the blame. They didn't want anyone thinking they assisted. They did everything deliberately, cleanly, quietly. The strangest part was that I wasn't angry. I wasn't even confused. I was sad, of course, but mostly I understood something I hadn't understood before. People make choices long before the world sees them. And sometimes the last thing they want is to pull someone else into that decision. To this day, whenever I think of them, I don't picture the scene by the river. I picture them standing on that bank earlier that afternoon, just taking it all in, just remembering something from long ago, knowing it would be the last time they saw it, choosing that moment with absolute clarity. It still unsettles me, but not in a chaotic way. More in a way that reminds me how private people's lives really are, even when you're standing a few feet away. The ending was clear the moment I saw them there together. They came to finish their story in the same place it started, and they did it exactly the way they planned. I was only a small part of the path that led them there, and I've spent years understanding that sometimes the most unsettling moments in this job aren't the dangerous ones. They're the moments when you witness something final, something chosen, something quiet, and you know there's nothing you could have done to change it. I had been preparing for the 3 feather challenge for years, long before it was my turn to actually do it. Everyone older than me spoke about it like it was some rite that changed you in a quiet, private way. One day without food, one day without speaking, and then the hardest part, one full day and night completely alone in the woods with only a knife and a tarp, staying unseen by any human, and then sneaking back into camp without getting spotted. By the time I was old enough, I felt ready, or at least I thought I was. I told myself that the woods were something I understood, something I grew up around. But the truth was that the woods always had their own way of reminding you that you were small and that you didn't really know them as well as you thought. By the morning of my 3rd day, I was already worn down. The no-food day had hit me harder than I expected. The no-speaking day made my thoughts louder, heavier, harder to shut out. And the full day and night alone in the wild with nothing but the knife and tarp had been a strange mixture of calm and unease. I had walked deeper than I ever had before, pushing past thick brush, weaving through clusters of old trees whose branches formed tight ceilings overhead. I chose the most overgrown, isolated corner of the forest I could find, a place where the undergrowth looked like it hadn't been stepped on in years. It felt right for the challenge, even if something inside me was unsure. The night passed slowly. It wasn't dramatic, nothing chased me, nothing stalked me, but the silence felt alive in its own way. Every small noise felt bigger. My tarp rustled. The breeze shifted. Small animals moved in the brush. I kept telling myself they were just normal sounds, the kind that happen every night, whether I'm there to hear them or not. When dawn grew close, a faint, cold blue light started creeping through the trees. I had barely slept, but I felt like I needed to move, needed to shake off that heavy night air. At the edge of that part of the woods was a lake I had seen earlier. The water was dark and still, almost perfectly flat, and I told myself a quick morning swim would help me wake up before I started the long walk back to camp. I felt filthy from the night, sticky from sweat and dirt. The idea of cold water felt like relief. I followed a faint game trail toward the lake. The ground was soft from layers of old leaves, the kind that break down into dark, spongy mulch. When I reached the shore, I noticed a thin mist floating over the surface of the water, moving slowly like breath. The sky was still pale and colorless, and the woods felt frozen in that early hour stillness. I stepped out of my clothes, leaving them folded on a patch of grass. The air was cold on my skin, but I was ready to get into the water anyway. I started walking toward the lake, taking slow steps to avoid making noise. That was when I froze. Near the far side of the lake, half hidden by the reeds, I saw a few silhouettes. A group of men. They were standing along the water with fishing rods, facing away from me. I didn't know if they were locals or random guys out before dawn, but it didn't matter. The challenge required me to remain unseen. That meant no swimming, no sound, no sudden movements. I turned to step back toward my clothes. The ground shifted under me. It didn't happen slowly. There was no warning. One step was normal, and the next made the earth collapse beneath my foot like rotten wood. The whole patch of ground sank at once. I tried to push myself backward, but the soil caved inward, dragging me down with it. In one instant, I dropped straight into a pit. The smell hit me before I understood what I'd fallen into. A thick, hot, rotting smell that punched the air out of my chest. I sank up to my armpits in something soft, wet, and horribly warm. It wasn't mud. It wasn't water. It felt like thick, dissolving meat, like stepping into a stomach turned inside out. My body locked up. My brain tried to make sense of it, but the smell was so strong it felt like it coated the inside of my mouth. I looked down. All I could see was a dark, reddish-brown mess bubbling slightly from slow rot. Bits of fur, shreds of skin, bones softened from weeks of decay, deer parts, dozens of them, a whole pit of guts and leftovers dumped by poachers and left to ferment under the dirt and leaves. The weight of it pressed against my ribs. I could feel things shifting under me in a slow, horrible slide, brushing against my stomach and legs as if something dead was moving even though it wasn't alive. I try not to throw up. The smell poured into my nose and stuck there like something physical. Every breath felt like I was pulling rot deeper into myself. I didn't want to scream, couldn't scream, because the men at the lake would hear. The rule said I had to remain unseen, and for some reason my mind held on to that rule like it was the only thing keeping me sane. I dug my hands into the dirt on the edge of the collapse, trying to pull myself out. The soil kept crumbling, and my arms shook. Every time I moved, wet, heavy pieces slid against my legs. Some floated, some sank. Every shift released new pockets of smell, hot enough that it felt like steam in my face. I dragged myself upward inch by inch, using roots, broken branches, anything my fingers could grab. My chest burned from trying not to breathe too deeply. My skin felt coated in greasy rot, the kind that didn't run off like water, but clung to me in thick layers. By the time I managed to pull my waist out of the pit, I could feel cold air on my back again, but the smell stayed glued to me. My legs still dangled in the mix, and I had to twist my body to free them. When I finally crawled out onto solid ground, I didn't stand. I couldn't. I lay on the forest floor, shaking, trying to keep quiet because the fishermen were still there and probably had no idea that a few dozen yards away someone had just climbed out of a pit full of rotting deer guts. I wiped myself off with leaves, but it barely did anything. Every part of me smelled like decay. My skin, my hands, my hair, everything. I forced myself to stay focused because the challenge wasn't over. I still had to get back to camp unseen, but walking meant carrying that smell with me like a cloud. It followed me through the trees. It clung to the back of my throat. Sometimes the wind shifted and blew the scent into my face again, making me freeze to avoid gagging. The walk back felt longer than the walk out. I kept to thick brush, moving slow, avoiding open trails so the sentries wouldn't see me. All the while my skin itched, not from bugs or branches, but from the sickening knowledge of what had soaked into it. When I finally reached the outskirts of camp, I crouched low and waited for the sentries to pass before slipping behind one of the storage tents. My heart thumped hard, but I made it without being spotted. That should have felt like victory, but all I could think about was the smell still rising off me. When I stepped into the campmaster's tent, he looked at me with this plain, unreadable expression. Then the smell reached him. He pulled his head back, not in disgust, but in a sharp, startled way, like he was trying to place what exactly he was smelling. I stood there covered in layers of rot, shaking from the cold and from the memory of sinking into that pile of death. I explained everything in simple pieces, still trying to breathe through my mouth. He didn't say much, didn't need to. He just nodded slowly and motioned me outside. They washed me down with buckets of cold water before letting me go anywhere near the main camp again. Even after scrubbing myself raw, I could still smell faint traces of it on my skin for days, like the scent had somehow gotten inside me in a way that soap couldn't reach. That was the moment the woods stopped feeling like a place I understood. I realized the forest had layers I had never imagined. Poachers had been using that remote part of the woods for years, and the pit had been there long before I walked over it. I had chosen that spot because it felt untouched, but it had its own dark history hidden just under the surface. I finished the challenge. I passed it, but that didn't feel like the important part anymore. The important part was knowing how fast the ground can give way, how easily you can vanish into something you never knew was there, and how the woods don't need to be haunted to scare you. They just need to be real. I still remember that trip in 2016 more clearly than I should after all these years. It was supposed to be one quiet night in eastern Pennsylvania, just a simple stop during a longer camping week. My boyfriend and I had done plenty of small trips like this, but this one felt different the moment we turned off the main road. The pavement ended faster than we expected, and the dirt road that replaced it looked like something people stopped using a long time ago. The edges of the woods seemed too close to the road, like they were leaning in on us, and my phone had already dropped to zero service. I kept checking the screen anyway, out of habit, but nothing ever came back. The campsite area was one of those free primitive spots you only find if you know where to look. No official signs, no bathrooms, no other people around. We had been looking forward to that part because we liked the idea of being fully alone for one night, but the silence felt heavier than usual. It had rained earlier, and the ground was wet in some spots, but there were long stretches of dry leaves that made everything quiet and dull, like sound wasn't moving properly through the trees. The first strange moment happened when we saw a truck pulled off to the side near a bend. A woman stood near the open hood. I first thought she was checking something because she leaned over the engine, but when she straightened up, she didn't look stressed or frustrated. She just stared at us in a way that didn't match someone waiting for help. Usually people wave or gesture or look hopeful, but she looked more like she expected us to stop without even asking. Her face didn't show worry, just a flat, steady look. She didn't smile, didn't signal, didn't do anything except track our car with her eyes. I didn't process anything strange at first, but my boyfriend tensed up, and I could feel in the way he slowed down just a little but didn't stop. He later said she didn't look like someone who actually needed help at all. I only noticed how still she stood, like she had been standing there longer than someone doing a quick check under their hood. She faded out of sight behind us as we kept going. The road changed from dirt with some gravel to long patches of exposed mud. The rain had ruined large sections, and the tires sliced into it loudly even at low speed. That forced us to drive farther than we planned because most of the first pull-offs were soft and looked like they'd sink a car if we tried parking. We finally found a drier path that cut away from the road with enough space for the tent and a fire ring someone had made earlier. There were signs of old use, lighter ash, wet logs that had been burned down to half stubs. We got to work setting up, stacking wood, unpacking food, trying to relax again. At first it felt peaceful. The rain had left a clean smell, and everything looked calm. Then I noticed a car pass on the road. It wasn't unusual since there were other back roads out there, but when the same car went by again about 10 minutes later, slowly, I paid more attention. The man inside didn't look forward like someone driving normally. His head turned toward us in a way that didn't seem casual. I thought maybe he was also searching for a good campsite like we were earlier. Then he came by again, then again, each time slow, each time watching us. The sound of his tires in the wet dirt became something I started waiting for without wanting to. My boyfriend looked uneasy but kept acting normal. The man eventually stopped coming by, but the feeling he left behind didn't go away quickly. Once the sun went down, the forest grew even heavier. It wasn't pitch black because the moon was bright, but the trees threw long shadows that made everything look wrong. Our fire helped, but the darkness beyond the ring of light pressed in like a wall. We ate, cleaned up, then crawled into the tent for the night. The quiet was almost too thick. Even small movements outside felt louder than usual. Sometime around 3 a.m, I woke up hard, like someone had shaken me. It wasn't a dream. It was a sound. A deep mechanical roar that lasted a few seconds, cut off, and then came again. I couldn't place it at all. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a car engine. It reminded me of metal being dragged hard over rough ground, but amplified in a way that didn't make sense out there. My boyfriend sat up fast. He looked out the tiny tent window, but I could tell he barely saw anything. The sound repeated again, far too loud and too strange to understand. I felt frozen. My breathing stayed tight and shallow, and every second stretched longer. The forest outside didn't move. Not even insects chirped. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Everything in me felt like something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. My boyfriend stayed low to the ground, listening. I kept waiting for footsteps or voices or something familiar, but the woods stayed completely still. The sound didn't come again after the first few bursts, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I kept hearing tiny rustles that might have been leaves or branches shifting, but in the dark and fear, they all sounded like footsteps circling the tent. I kept imagining someone standing right outside, waiting for us to come out. We stayed like that for a long time. I don't know how long, because time didn't feel real then. Every sound outside made my heart slam in my chest. I thought I heard something brushing the wet grass near the tent. I thought I saw a shadow move across the dim moonlight outside the thin fabric wall. Nothing felt safe, not even breathing. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get dressed. He was steady but tense. My hand was shaking while I pulled my clothes on. He pulled the machete from its packaging, the plastic crinkling louder than anything else around us. When he unzipped the tent door, the air felt cold and sharp. The campsite looked almost exactly how we left it, but the quiet felt wrong. The moon lit everything enough to see clearly, and I scanned the ground around the fire pit. Our footprints were messy from earlier, but I didn't see anything obvious at first. Then I noticed a beer sitting right beside the remains of our fire. Silver, slightly crushed on one side. We never brought beer. It wasn't there before. The sight of it made my legs feel weak. We rushed through packing. The wet gear slapped against the inside of the trunk. I looked around again, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. Nothing moved. No voices. No retreating footsteps. Just still woods and a cold quiet that felt loaded with something unseen. We got into the car and drove out slowly at first because of the mud. The night around us stayed black and empty, but my mind kept imagining shapes between the trees. When the road straightened out a little, my boyfriend sped up. He later told me he thought someone might have tried to lure us out or scare us out of the tent. The sound we heard had been too close, not miles away like he whispered earlier. He didn't say that at the time because he didn't want panic to make us do something stupid. He also worried someone could have tampered with the gas tank to trap us there, but we had a hybrid, so even that wouldn't have stopped us completely. We didn't calm down for a long time, even after we reached better roads. The adrenaline left a strange, hollow feeling in my body. The rest of the trip, we stayed in crowded campgrounds or booked hotels when we could. Neither of us wanted silence or isolation again during that week. We didn't talk much about what happened until months later. I still think about the woman with the truck, the man circling us in his car, the strange metal sound in the middle of nowhere, and the beer that showed up after we fell asleep. Maybe none of them were connected. Maybe all of it was coincidence. But I don't believe that. Something or someone was out there with us that night. Someone walked through our camp while we slept, close enough to leave something behind, but not close enough for us to see. I don't know what their plan was, but I know we left at the right time. The ending to it all is simple and clear. We never went back to any place that remote again. Every time we camp now, we pick sites where other people are always nearby. It isn't the same kind of quiet we used to love, but it's the only kind that feels safe. Because whatever happened that night in eastern Pennsylvania, it taught me one thing I still believe. The scariest part of the woods isn't the animals or the darkness. It's the people you don't hear, the ones you don't see, and the moments you only understand once you're already driving away. I had been a park ranger for almost 5 years at a large national forest in the Pacific Northwest. I knew the terrain like the back of my hand, from the narrow jeep trails to the dense cedar groves that seemed to block out the sun in the middle of the afternoon. I'd worked every kind of shift, from patrolling the main roads to checking backcountry campsites on foot. Most days were routine, but some nights reminded me why the job was both exhausting and unnervingly intense. One night in late September became one of the most unsettling experiences of my career. It was just past dusk when I started my evening patrol. The forest was already dripping in shadows, the kind that stretch and twist as the light fades. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. My truck headlights cut through the gloom in narrow beams, illuminating the gravel road ahead, and occasionally catching the shine of a creek that ran parallel. I had a couple of routine stops that evening, mostly checking that trailheads were clear, fire pits were properly extinguished, and campers had left on time, but I felt a slight unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I drove slowly down a dirt road that led to one of the backcountry camping areas. It was a section of the forest that saw little traffic, even in summer. The trees were enormous here, centuries old, their trunks thick and knotted, roots breaking the surface in sharp angles. I pulled up at the first campsite I needed to check, a small clearing barely big enough for a single tent. There was no one there, and everything looked fine. No trash, no evidence of fire left burning. I noted it down and moved on. The next site was further along the road, a bit more secluded. As I drove, I noticed something strange. The headlights reflected off something metallic by the side of the road. I slowed down and saw an abandoned bicycle, lying face down in the dirt. That was odd. The nearest road was nearly a mile away, and the last vehicle I'd passed was a maintenance truck an hour earlier. There were no footprints, no tire tracks leading to it, just the bike itself. My stomach tightened slightly, but I shrugged it off and kept driving. I reached the campsite, a wider clearing surrounded by a circle of thick underbrush. I stepped out, boots crunching on dry leaves, and did my usual sweep. Fire ring was empty. Tent was folded neatly as if the occupants had just left. Nothing out of place. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Barefoot, small, heading away from the campsite into the denser forest. My heart rate quickened. The prints didn't make sense. The campsite had been empty, yet the footprints were fresh, sinking into the soft earth, leading deeper into the shadows. I grabbed my flashlight and started following them, staying close enough to the open road so I wouldn't get completely lost. The forest swallowed the light, and every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. Twigs snapped underfoot, and a faint rustling came from the brush beside me. I kept my hand on my sidearm. Not that I expected to use it, but it was standard protocol for situations that felt off. After about 10 minutes, the footprints disappeared near a creek. I shone my flashlight around, but saw nothing. Then I heard it, the faint dragging sound of something moving across the wet leaves, accompanied by a low, almost human groan. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. Bears growl, but not like that, not dragging something. My training told me to stay calm, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I decided to retreat to my truck and radio in a situation report. I moved slowly, every shadow making me second-guess the path. As I approached the road, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of my flashlight beam. A figure, hunched, moving quickly behind the trees, disappearing almost instantly. I didn't see a face, only the shape, thin and human-like, but the way it moved was off, unnatural, fast, almost desperate. My hands shook as I got back into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. I radioed dispatch. Base, I'm near campsite 12. Something odd here. Could be a lost hiker, but I need backup. My voice was steady, but my fingers still trembled. There was a pause, then acknowledgement. I drove slowly down the road, headlights scanning every shadow, every bend. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I had a gut feeling I wasn't alone. About a mile down the road, I saw movement again, a flash of dark clothing running across the road, disappearing into the trees. I stopped, grabbed my flashlight again, and called out, but there was no response. My heart was pounding, but I stayed calm. Using the truck spotlight, I scanned the area. Nothing, just a forest, still and dark. Backup arrived within 20 minutes. We searched the area thoroughly. The footprints were gone, and the abandoned bike was gone too. No sign of anyone, no disturbance beyond what I had seen. We filed a report, and I stayed in the area for the rest of my shift, checking the campsites, patrolling the back roads. By morning, the forest seemed normal again, quiet, calm, untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was never explained. Hikers hadn't reported anyone missing in the area. No animals made that sound. The incident stayed with me because it reminded me that even in a place you know intimately, where every trail and tree seems familiar, the forest can hold things that don't make sense. That night reinforced the one rule I always followed. Respect the wilderness, stay alert, and never underestimate the unknown. Even now, years later, I remember that night with clarity. The abandoned bike, the footprints, the sound, and the figure moving in the shadows. I never found out who or what it was, but I know the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets walk close enough that you can hear them. I was on a late summer shift as a park ranger in one of the more remote sections of the national forest. The kind of place where cell service disappears and the roads turn to dirt and gravel, twisting through dense pine and oak. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. and a slight chill had begun to settle into the air. I was driving slowly along one of the service roads, scanning the area for illegal campfires, hikers who hadn't checked in, or signs of wildlife distress. My truck's headlights cut through the gloom in neat rectangles, revealing nothing but empty road and thick trees on either side. I always felt the weight of isolation on nights like this, but it was part of the job, part of the responsibility I had chosen. About 30 minutes into the shift, I noticed tire tracks on a narrow side path, faint impressions in the soft dirt, partially overgrown with small shrubs. They weren't recent, but they were noticeable enough to suggest a vehicle had passed through in the last couple of days. My gut told me to check it out. I turned the truck onto the path, careful to keep it slow. The canopy above made it almost pitch black despite my headlights, and the scent of damp earth and pine grew stronger. I noticed the air had a sharp edge, a kind of tension you can feel rather than see. The path curved sharply to the left, leading to a small clearing. That's when I saw it. A vehicle, old and dusty, half hidden by trees. Its windows were coated in a thin layer of grime, the kind that suggested it hadn't moved in months, yet the tracks were fresh. That discrepancy made my stomach tighten. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and approached carefully. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Even the usual chorus of insects and distant owls had retreated. I walked around the car, shining my flashlight over it. The doors were locked, but there was no license plate. Inside, I could see scattered belongings, an empty thermos, a backpack, and a pair of muddy boots that didn't match the size of the vehicle. I started taking notes, photographing the scene. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't place it. My experience in the forest had taught me that often the most unnerving situations are entirely human, not supernatural. I had dealt with poachers, lost hikers, and people attempting to live off the grid illegally. And usually, there was a logical explanation if you stayed calm and methodical. As I circled the car, I heard a faint snapping of branches behind me. I froze, listening. Nothing else. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, careful, like someone moving quietly but intentionally. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees, and then it happened again. Louder this time, closer, just beyond the clearing. I retraced my steps slowly to the truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadows. The hairs on my neck were standing straight up. When I reached the truck, I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were tense, gripping the wheel. As I turned to leave the clearing, I noticed footprints in the mud near the back of the vehicle, freshly pressed into the soil, leading deeper into the forest. They weren't human in proportion. They were larger, heavier, uneven, as though the person walking had some kind of limp or imbalance. My heart started pounding, but I reminded myself to think rationally. Whatever it was, it had been here recently, and it could still be nearby. I called dispatch on the radio, explaining the situation and the vehicle, describing the footprints. They instructed me to wait for backup before approaching again. The minutes crawled by, each second amplifying the silence around me. The forest felt alive in an almost threatening way. I kept scanning the tree line, my eyes straining to catch any movement, the truck's engine rumbling quietly beneath me. I began to notice subtle signs. A broken branch hanging from a tree, small depressions in the leaf litter, the faint rustle of leaves, but no figure emerged. It was as though someone had vanished into thin air. Backup arrived about 40 minutes later, 2 more rangers in a second truck. We approached the vehicle together, methodically searching the perimeter. By now, my initial unease had transformed into focused vigilance. We discovered more evidence of recent human presence. Discarded wrappers, a tattered jacket caught on a low branch, and faint handprints in the mud on the vehicle. Nothing indicated immediate danger, but the fact someone had been there and left footprints heading deeper into the forest meant we couldn't dismiss it. We tracked the prints for over an hour, moving carefully, calling out periodically, but the trail ended abruptly at a small creek. There was no bridge, no way to cross easily without leaving our own marks. Whatever had made them had disappeared entirely. We returned to the vehicle, documenting everything thoroughly, and eventually, I stayed until the next day with other rangers to monitor the area. No one was ever found, and the vehicle remained abandoned, eventually towed away for evidence. That night, as I patrolled the perimeter alone again, I kept thinking about how easy it would have been for someone to hide completely, to move through the forest without leaving more than a hint of their presence. It reminded me that in the wilderness, the most terrifying things are not wild animals or storms, but the human mind and what is capable of when pushed into isolation. I realized the forest could be utterly silent, yet brimming with unseen life. And that life didn't need to be supernatural to be frightening. The experience stayed with me for years, a reminder that even in the safest ranger stations or the most secure patrol routes, the forest holds secrets that you may never fully understand. In the end, I returned to that section of the park many times, never seeing anyone or anything unusual again. But the lesson remained. The forest is vast, and people can disappear in it just as easily as they appear. You can prepare, you can patrol, you can follow all protocols, but you can never predict the choices of others or the consequences of walking alone in places few will ever tread. The vehicle, the footprints, the strange presence, those were real, human things, and they reminded me that reality can be scarier than any story. I have been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, working in a large national forest that stretched over hundreds of square miles of dense pine, fir, and oak. The kind of forest where the sun disappears quickly behind thick canopies, and where silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's a presence you feel crawling along your skin. I was used to long nights, responding to stranded hikers, checking fire lines, and monitoring wildlife. But one night in late October, something happened that reminded me just how fragile the sense of safety can be, even in a place you know like the back of your hand. It started as a routine evening patrol. I was driving my old Ford truck along one of the lesser-used logging roads in the northern part of the park, the kind of road where ruts and loose gravel made you drive slowly, and where the headlights never seemed to illuminate far enough ahead. I had my flashlight ready, my radio on, and my dog, a German shepherd named Tucker, lying across the passenger seat, ears perked as he always was when the forest was quiet. The first sign that something wasn't right was subtle. Tucker, who usually slept through the monotonous vibrations of the truck on rough roads, suddenly sat up, stiff and alert. His low growl didn't startle me. He had a habit of reacting to deer or raccoons before I ever saw them. But this was different. It wasn't playful or defensive. It was tense, almost fearful. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally between the trunks, though the wind was still. There was nothing visible, but Tucker refused to lie down again. I parked near a small clearing I had used before for inspections and stepped out. The crunch of gravel under my boots echoed strangely in the still night, louder than it should have been. I started walking toward the edge of the clearing, keeping my flashlight sweeping over the surrounding woods. My ears strained to catch any hint of movement beyond the occasional rustle of leaves. That's when I heard it, the sound of branches breaking just beyond the light's reach. Not a single branch falling, but several in a pattern that suggested something, or someone was moving quickly but deliberately, trying not to be seen. Tucker barked sharply once, and then froze, ears tilted backward, growling low. I realized my heart had picked up its pace. It was easy to rationalize it at first. Hunters in the off-season, campers who had wandered too far, a lost hiker. But nothing about the sounds matched normal human movement. The spacing of the branch snaps was off, irregular, as if the mover was unusually tall or moving in a way that didn't feel natural. I started walking slowly back to my truck, my flashlight beam cutting across the ground, highlighting pine needles, rocks, and animal tracks. That's when I noticed the footprints. Large, wide, and deeper than any humans would make, pressed into the soft earth along the edge of the clearing. They weren't bare prints. They were elongated, almost like someone had altered their stride by wrapping something around their feet. I cursed under my breath. my mind racing through possibilities. Poacher, someone trespassing with dangerous intent, a criminal hiding in the woods. I turned back toward the direction the prints led, trying to keep my breathing steady. Tucker was on alert again, growling quietly, body tense. I shined my flashlight along the tree line, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure, tall, crouched, moving between the shadows like it was part of the forest itself. I froze. My first instinct was to radio for backup, but my radio crackled only static. It was as if the forest had swallowed the signal entirely. I decided not to pursue blindly. Instead, I retraced my steps slowly, keeping the truck within reach. Every snap of a twig, every brush of leaves made my stomach tighten. The sounds followed me in a pattern, never getting closer but never disappearing. The forest felt alive, observing, holding its breath with me. I checked the clearing one last time and noticed something else. My flashlight illuminated a series of marks scratched into the bark of several trees near the trailhead. They weren't deep, but deliberate, vertical, irregular, and too consistent to be random. Someone had been here, and they had been leaving a trail or a message. Finally, I reached the truck, and Tucker jumped in immediately, as if sensing that this was a temporary escape. I locked the doors and started the engine. As I slowly drove back toward the main road, keeping my eyes on every shadow, I thought about what I had just experienced. Whoever or whatever was out there knew the forest, the trails, the sounds. They weren't afraid of me. They were patient, watching, and they could move without making themselves easy to find. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was exhausted, adrenaline still buzzing in my veins. I filed a report detailing the footprints, the scratches, and the strange movement in the woods. Days later, patrols combed the area, but no one was ever found. The scratches remained on the trees, fading slowly with time, but the feeling that I wasn't alone in that part of the forest stayed with me for weeks. I learned that night that the wilderness has its own rules, and sometimes the things that move within it are smarter and more patient than any human can predict. From then on, every time I patrolled that northern section of the park, Tucker never left my side, and I never ventured out at night alone. The forest looked the same, smelled the same, and sounded the same during the day, but I knew, and he knew, that something had been there, and it could still be there. That understanding never left me, and I think it's why I became more cautious, more observant, and more respectful of the quiet patience of the wild. I had been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, working in the vast wilderness of northern Arizona. The forest there is dense, filled with ponderosa pines and steep, rocky ridges that drop into canyons so deep you can't see the bottom. I was used to being alone. Most of the time, I liked it. The quiet, the smell of pine, the occasional rustle of wildlife. It was calming. But there was one night, not long ago, that reminded me that being alone in the forest could also be terrifying in ways I wasn't prepared for. It was late October, the night's cold but not freezing yet. I had been patrolling a remote section of the park along a rarely used dirt road that led to an old fire lookout. The lookout itself was abandoned now. The metal staircase rusted and the windows thick with grime, but the view was incredible. From there, you could see miles of forest stretching into the horizon, the Mogollon Rim cutting sharply against the sky. I had parked my truck at the base of the trail and decided to hike up, flashlight in hand, to check the area for signs of illegal hunting or campers who might have wandered off trail. The hike was normal at first. The leaves underfoot were dry and crisp, breaking with a satisfying crunch as I climbed. The wind whispered through the trees, and occasionally I could hear the distant howl of a coyote. Nothing unusual. I reached the lookout around 9 p.m., set down my pack, and started inspecting the structure. That's when I noticed it. Faint footprints in the dirt near the base of the staircase. At first, I thought it might be a lost hiker or someone who had slipped off the main road. The prints were deep, clearly made by boots, and they headed up the trail I had just climbed. I called out softly, just in case someone was there, but there was no response. My voice seemed swallowed by the forest. I decided to follow the prints down a small side trail leading from the lookout, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trail was narrow and steep, and the further I went, the more I noticed the footprints changing. They became more erratic, sometimes large, sometimes small, and occasionally they circled back on themselves. Whoever, or whatever, had been here wasn't walking in a straight path. They were wandering, almost searching. My gut started to tighten. I had hiked this area countless times, and something about the footprints felt wrong. My training told me to stay calm, to observe, but instinct was screaming at me to leave. That's when I heard it, a snapping of twigs close by. I froze. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing at first. Then I caught movement just at the edge of the light. Something was shifting behind a thick cluster of bushes just off the trail. I crouched low, hand on my radio, ready to call for backup if I needed it. My dog, Ranger, who had been with me for years on patrols, stood silently beside me. Normally, he would bark at any strange presence, but this time he whimpered quietly, ears flat, tail down. I had never seen him like that. The rustling continued, slower now, deliberate. Whoever it was moving with purpose, but staying just out of view. I followed the trail a little further, careful not to make noise. The prints led to a small clearing. That's when I saw them, an old campsite, long abandoned but recently used. A few pieces of broken camping gear lay scattered, a tattered sleeping bag, an empty propane canister, a dented metal pot. The fire pit was cold, but had fresh ashes. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. The thought of someone living off the grid in this section of the park sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't illegal per se, but in this area, it was dangerous. People had died here before from exposure from wildlife. As I examined the site, I noticed something else, scratch marks on the nearby trees. Deep, jagged gouges, too high for an animal, placed almost as if to warn or mark territory. My heart rate quickened. This was no lost hiker. Whoever had been here was experienced, maybe even violent. I considered leaving immediately, but I had a responsibility to document this for the park files. I radioed the main station, quietly describing the scene. They advised me to retreat slowly and wait for backup before approaching the area. I did as they said, moving carefully back toward the main trail. That's when I heard again a low, deliberate rustle, not from the trees, but from the ground. Something large was moving behind the bushes. Ranger growled this time, low and tense. I shined a flashlight, but there was nothing, and then the sound stopped. Silence. I made it back to my truck without incident, adrenaline still pumping. I waited in the cab until the backup ranger arrived around 1 a.m. We returned to the clearing together the next morning, and the site was gone, completely erased, like no one had been there in weeks. No footprints, no gear, no fire pit. The trees were intact, no scratches visible. It was as if someone had moved with extreme care to leave no trace. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. I filed my report. The park supervisors noted the location, but no one ever found any trace afterward. I didn't feel safe patrolling that section alone again. I stick to the main roads and trails now, and I always bring backup when I have to go into the deeper areas. That night taught me something important. The forest can feel calm and safe one moment, and completely unpredictable the next. Some things out there are real, and they don't need ghosts or monsters to be terrifying. Being a park ranger isn't just about rescuing hikers or putting out fires. Sometimes it's about witnessing the raw, untamed side of nature and knowing that it doesn't care about you or whether you're ready to see it. That night, I realized how thin the line is between quiet wilderness and something that can make your blood run cold. I never saw anyone, and maybe I never will, but the memory of that night is always with me in every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, every distant howl in the forest. It's a reminder that some dangers aren't obvious, and that staying alert isn't just about duty, it's about survival. I have been a park ranger for almost 6 years, mostly working the backcountry sections of the National Forest in northern Arizona. The work was mostly routine, checking trails, inspecting campsites, occasionally dealing with lost hikers or illegal hunters. But there were days that reminded me just how unpredictable the wilderness could be, and one night in late October reminded me more than any other. I was doing my usual solo patrol of the northern stretch of the forest. The sun had just gone down, and the temperature was dropping fast. I had my standard gear: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and a revolver. Not because I expected trouble, but because in these areas, encounters with wildlife, or worse, were not impossible. My truck was parked near the trailhead, but I had decided to hike in a few miles to check an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in years. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant owl calling. About 2 miles into the trail, I reached a small clearing. I set down my pack to rest for a few minutes, listening to the wind sweep through the pines. That's when I noticed something odd. Small footprints in the dirt, too large for a coyote, too small for a bear. They were fresh, pointing into the thicker forest. I froze. There were no marked trails there, no paths anyone usually took. My gut tightened. I radioed base to report unusual tracks, describing them in detail. Base responded that there had been no reports of hikers missing or trespassers, and to stay cautious. I should have turned back, but something about the tracks pulled me in. The forest grew darker, the canopy above blocking out the moonlight almost entirely. My flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating patches of fallen leaves and moss. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of movement just beyond the reach of the light, but when I swung the beam toward it, nothing was there. Still, the footprints continued deeper into the forest, almost as if someone or something was deliberately leading me somewhere. After about 20 minutes, I reached another clearing. The footprints stopped abruptly. I scanned the area, my pulse quickening. That's when I heard it, a low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It came from behind a cluster of pines to my left. My hand instinctively went to my flashlight, then to my revolver. I crept closer, staying low and quiet, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. The dragging noise stopped. I shined my flashlight through the trees and froze. There, partially hidden in the shadows, was an old hunting blind that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But it wasn't empty. Inside, I could make out a figure crouched, barely moving. My mind raced. Could be a trespasser, could be someone hurt, could be something worse. I stayed low, circling around to get a better view. The figure didn't move as I approached, but then I saw the glint of something metallic, a knife I realized in their hand. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the blind. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I thought about calling for backup, but the signal was weak out here, barely enough to ping my location to base. Then I heard it, a whisper of movement behind me, close enough that I felt the air shift. I spun, flashlight sweeping, and saw nothing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I decided I had enough. Slowly, keeping my eyes on the blind, I retraced my steps toward the main trail, moving silently but quickly. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense. Once I reached the trail, I broke into a run, staying low, scanning the edges of the forest for any sign of movement. The tracks I had been following were gone, as if they had never existed. My radio crackled faintly with Base checking in, asking if I was okay. I swallowed hard and reported back that I was returning to the truck. The forest seemed endless as I ran. The shadows between the trees were unnervingly deep, and the occasional animal calls only heightened my sense of being watched. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw the headlights of my truck. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, checking behind me until I was safely inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove slowly back toward the ranger station. Every so often, I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone emerging from the darkness. Nothing. When I returned to the station, I checked in and wrote a full report. My fellow rangers laughed it off as my imagination running wild, but I knew what I had seen. The tracks, the dragging sound, the figure in the blind, it was real. Whatever it was It had been clever enough to stay hidden, to avoid detection, and it wasn't the kind of person you stumble upon by accident. I spent the next few nights patrolling that same stretch of forest, but I never saw the tracks again, never saw any sign of that figure. Weeks later, I learned from local authorities that a man had been arrested in a neighboring county, suspected of kidnapping attempts in rural areas. The descriptions matched what I had seen that night: clothing, weapon, even methods. It hit me then. I had stumbled onto something dangerous, and I had walked away by pure luck and caution. That night stayed with me, a reminder that the forest holds secrets not in the form of ghosts or legends, but of very real threats, human or otherwise. And I never followed random tracks into a clearing again. I had been a park ranger for a few years by the time it happened, but no amount of experience could have prepared me for that night. I was working a solo night shift in one of the more remote areas of the forest, a section of dense pines and rocky outcrops that few visitors ventured into after dark. The kind of place where even during the day, the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. My routine was simple: check the trails, monitor any suspicious activity, and make sure campers were safe. That night, the air was unusually still, heavy with the scent of wet pine and damp earth from a recent rain. I drove my ranger truck slowly along the dirt road, headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio crackling faintly with static in the silence. About an hour into my shift, I noticed something odd near a small clearing. A faint, flickering light, like a flashlight, moving erratically between the trees. That was unusual. Most hikers stayed on marked trails, and this was a section marked restricted access. I parked the truck a safe distance away and stepped out, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. The forest was unnervingly quiet, almost as if the animals themselves had gone still to watch. My flashlight beam swept across the underbrush, but I saw nothing. Whatever had caused the light had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, like someone had been trying to start a fire and abandoned it. I chalked it up to a lost hiker or someone trespassing and made a mental note to report it when I returned. I continued along the trail, keeping my radio close, listening for any sign of distress. That's when I heard it: soft, deliberate footsteps. Not the random scurry of a deer or a raccoon, but human steps. Slow, careful, following the curve of the path behind me. My first instinct was to call out, but something told me not to. The forest was too quiet for normal conversation. I paused and waited, holding my flashlight tight. The footsteps stopped. I started walking again, slower this time, keeping my ears tuned. The forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were taller, the darkness deeper, and every shadow seemed to shift when I looked directly at it. Then I heard again, a rustling, closer this time, coming from a side trail that led deeper into the woods. I knew this section well, every rock and fallen log, but nothing in my training had prepared me for the feeling of being watched. I decided to check the side trail, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The rain had turned it into a slick mud track, making my footsteps loud against the soft soil. About 50 feet in, I saw it, fresh footprints, human, heading in the same direction as mine. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, deliberately. The prints stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. That didn't make sense. The ground was soft. Nothing could have hidden so quickly. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rangers have to stay calm. I kept following the trail, which led to a small creek crossing. The moonlight barely touched the water, casting distorted reflections on the rocks. That's when I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A figure crouched low on the other side, watching me. No flashlight, no signal, just a dark silhouette. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was human, and I knew it was dangerous. I didn't panic, but I did take a step back and radio dispatch, giving them my location and explaining that I might have an intruder in the area. The figure didn't move, just stayed crouched, blending with the shadows. I waited, heart hammering, listening to the water rushing over rocks and the faint rustle of leaves. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, the figure bolted, disappearing into the trees with impossible speed. My flashlight swung wildly, but there was nothing to see. I didn't chase. That was a mistake I've learned never to repeat. I backed away slowly, retracing my steps to the main trail. The forest seemed alive now, every snapping twig and falling leaf setting my nerves on edge. I returned to my truck, locked the doors, and waited for backup, shaking despite my best efforts to remain professional. When the backup arrived an hour later, we scoured the area but found no trace of the figure, no sign of fire, no footprints beyond the ones I had followed. We spent the rest of the night patrolling the area in pairs. By morning, the forest seemed peaceful again, almost mocking in its normalcy. The only evidence that anything had happened was the lingering smell of smoke and the prints that disappeared so suddenly. The incident was reported, filed away as a potential trespassing case, but I never found out who it was. No one was caught, and the forest stayed as mysterious as ever. That night taught me a hard lesson. The wilderness is unpredictable, and not all danger is obvious. People can vanish into it, move through it without leaving a trace, and no amount of experience can prepare you for that kind of encounter. I never saw that figure again, but every time I patrol those trails alone, I remember the way it watched me from the shadows, and the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. By the time my shift ended, I had logged the incident, filed my report, and driven out of the forest, but the feeling stayed with me for weeks, an invisible weight reminding me that some nights the forest doesn't just test you, it watches. I had been working as a park ranger in the northern part of Arizona for a little over 3 years by the time this incident happened. It was late September, and the forest was starting to shift from the deep greens of summer into the muted browns and golds of fall. I had a week of solo patrols, the kind where I drove long stretches of dirt and paved roads, checked trails, and kept an eye on campers, hikers, and hunters. Most of the time, the work was quiet, almost boring. But one night reminded me why I took this job, and why it could be dangerous in ways people don't expect. I was doing a routine check of a remote section of the park near a series of small, jagged cliffs. The sun had set hours before, and the sky was a flat black, dotted with stars that were just starting to glint. My truck was parked at the trailhead, and I had my flashlight, radio, and a pack with a few essentials. The usual sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. The wind rustling through the pines, the faint call of an owl, the distant trickle of a creek. Everything was calm. Too calm, as it turned out. I started walking along a narrow trail that twisted along the edge of the cliffs. It was one of those old ranger paths, barely wide enough for one person, lined with loose gravel and dead leaves. I always carried a small hatchet and a heavy-duty flashlight when I went into these areas at night, just in case. I had learned the hard way that injuries or accidents could happen fast, and backup could be hours away. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the soft dirt on the trail, boots fairly heavy, heading deeper into the forest. That wasn't unusual in itself. Hikers and hunters left tracks all the time. But the tracks were fresh, and they weren't following the main trail. They veered off into a dense thicket, a part of the forest I didn't patrol often because it was rough and steep. I paused, listening. At first, I thought I heard branches snapping, but it was faint, almost imperceptible. I shone my flashlight toward the thicket. The beam caught the glint of a metal object, a knife, I realized, partially buried in the dirt. I felt a surge of unease. Someone had been here recently, and whoever it was had no intention of following the main path. I radioed the ranger station to give a heads up, using the routine code for check-in, though I didn't mention the tracks. By the time I finished, I realized I could hear something else. A low rustling, moving from one tree to another, too deliberate for an animal. My dog, Ranger, a German shepherd I sometimes brought on patrols, was pacing at my side, growling quietly, his hackles raised. I tried to calm him, but the tension was building fast. I had a gut feeling that this was no ordinary hiker. I followed the tracks cautiously, flashlights sweeping side to side. The forest grew thicker, darker, and the trail disappeared entirely. Every step felt heavier. Loose stones underfoot, roots catching my boots. Then, I noticed something even stranger. Pieces of a torn backpack scattered along the ground. Cloth, a broken water bottle, and a pair of gloves. Whoever had been here had moved through quickly and left behind signs of a struggle. Or maybe they had been startled. The rational part of me tried to dismiss it, but instinct screamed danger. I continued for another 20 minutes, the footprints leading down into a shallow ravine that emptied into a small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing, and I froze. There were more footprints, larger, muddy, some overlapping smaller ones. I could see where something had been dragged. My heart was pounding, and Ranger whined low in my ear. I decided then that I couldn't risk going further without backup. I backed slowly toward the trail, making sure to leave a clear path behind me, and called the station again. It took nearly half an hour for another ranger to arrive. When he did, we approached the clearing together. The evidence was disturbing. A campsite had been hastily abandoned, personal items scattered. There were signs of scuffle, bent stakes from a tent, scorch marks from a knocked-over campfire, and a bloody branch. No bodies, no immediate sign of what had happened. But it was clear someone had been in serious trouble. The tracks disappeared into the deeper woods, toward an area too rough to safely pursue at night. We marked the location, took photographs, and reported it to the local sheriff's office. Over the next few days, search teams combed the area. They found signs that someone had been living rough, moving stealthily, possibly injured. Eventually, they discovered a man hiding in a cave several miles away. He had gotten lost after a hunting trip and panicked when he realized no one was around. He survived, but barely, and he had left the signs of struggle in the clearing we had found. It wasn't a criminal act, but the fear and danger were real. That night stayed with me. Walking through the forest alone, knowing someone could be hiding just out of sight was terrifying. It reminded me that the forest doesn't need to be haunted to be dangerous. People get lost, panic, or make mistakes that put themselves and others at risk. After that incident, I adjusted my patrol routines. I never went into isolated areas at night alone again, and I always made sure someone knew exactly where I was going. The experience changed the way I saw the forest. It wasn't just a park full of trails and wildlife. It was a place where a single wrong step or a moment of bad luck could turn into a nightmare. Years later, I still think about that night whenever I hear the wind in the trees or see fresh tracks on a trail. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost story, but it was real. It was fear, it was danger, and it was a stark reminder of why I became a ranger in the first place. To keep people safe, even when the forest feels like it's watching. I was a park ranger in a fairly remote national forest in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where the trees were thick, the fog hung low, and the roads were little more than gravel tracks winding through steep hills. I had been working the night shift that week, mostly checking the backcountry trails, keeping an eye out for illegal campers, and making sure that hikers didn't get themselves lost or injured. The forest had its usual quiet, too quiet at night, when the wind rustled the tops of the firs, and the only sound was the occasional scurry of small animals in the underbrush. I liked that quiet most of the time. It was peaceful, but it also had a way of making your mind exaggerate every little sound. That night, I was on a routine patrol, driving one of the older park trucks along a service road that followed a ridge overlooking a narrow river canyon. The headlights barely reached more than 30 feet in front of me, and everything beyond that was an endless dark blur. The fog was thick, clinging to the trees and ground like damp cloth. I was alone, my radio silent except for the occasional crackle, and my only company was my own breath and the sound of the truck's tires crunching gravel. About an hour into the patrol, I spotted something out up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a fallen branch. But as I got closer, I realized there was a small campfire burning in a clearing that wasn't marked on any of the park's maps. That wasn't unusual by itself. People often strayed from designated sites. But what caught my attention was that the fire seemed fresh, and there was no car or tent visible nearby. The ground around it was trampled as if several people had been walking back and forth. I slowed the truck, keeping the headlights focused on the fire, trying to see if anyone was around. Then I noticed movement. Something or someone was crouched just past the fire, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees. My heart rate picked up. As a ranger, I was trained for dealing with people, animals, and emergencies, but there's always a split second when your mind jumps to worst-case scenarios. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they didn't move like a normal person. They shifted slowly, almost gliding, and seemed unnaturally still for someone crouching near a fire. I considered calling in over the radio, but the signal was weak in that part of the canyon. I kept my eyes on the figure while slowly maneuvering the truck closer, but suddenly it vanished. Just gone. 1 second it was there, the next the darkness swallowed it completely. I slammed the truck into park and jumped out, flashlight in hand. The forest was silent, except for the occasional creak of tree limbs. I scanned the area, circling the fire, my boots crunching in the gravel and fallen pine needles. Nothing. No footprints leading away, no sign of a trail. Only the fire still burning, small and orange against the dark. I should have left. Every rational thought in my head said to leave immediately and report it later. But I was curious and cautious. I wanted to make sure nobody was hurt or stranded in the forest. I approached the fire, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, shining over the uneven ground. That's when I noticed something else, strange marks around the fire pit. They weren't footprints. They were scratches in the dirt, deep and jagged, like someone had clawed at the ground. My stomach sank. I had seen bear scratches before, but these didn't match any pattern I recognized. They were too deliberate, almost like someone or something had been digging or struggling near the fire. I backed up slowly, shining the flashlight toward the trees around the clearing. That's when I heard it, a low, dragging sound like something heavy moving across the forest floor. It wasn't a branch snapping or an animal shuffling. It was deliberate. It came from the dense line of trees just beyond the clearing. My pulse shot up. I grabbed my radio and finally got a weak signal, calling my location and explaining what I saw. My voice shook slightly, even though I tried to keep it steady. The operator acknowledged my position and told me backup was on the way, but it would take at least 20 minutes to arrive. I stayed near the truck, keeping the flashlight trained on the clearing. The sound got closer. Then I noticed movement again, faint, almost imperceptible, just beyond the tree line. I thought about how easy it would be to make a run for it, but the terrain was uneven and running blindly in that fog was a risk. Instead, I grabbed my sidearm and waited, trying to keep calm. Whatever was out, there was moving slowly but steadily, circling the clearing, staying just beyond the light. After what felt like hours was probably only minutes, the forest fell silent again. I kept my eyes on the shadows, expecting something to reappear, but nothing did. Then I noticed the fire. It had gone out almost completely, leaving only a few glowing embers. That made no sense. There had been no wind strong enough to put it out, and I hadn't seen anyone leave. I got back in the truck, keeping the flashlight out the window, and started moving slowly down the road toward Ranger Station. The whole time, I felt like something was following me, just at the edge of the fog, but every time I looked, there was nothing. By the time I reached the station, I was shaking and covered in sweat. I reported the incident in full detail, but without evidence. The story didn't gain much attention. The next day, I went back to the clearing in daylight. Everything looked normal. No fire, no marks, nothing to indicate someone or something had been there the night before. Even the trampled ground was smoothed over by fallen leaves. It was as if the night had never happened. I never figured out what I saw that night. No campers reported being in the area, and there were no animals that could have caused the marks or the sounds. But after that night, I always carried extra lighting, a backup radio, and never patrolled that road alone at night. Something was out there, something big and deliberate, but it left no trace. The forest can be silent, peaceful, and breathtaking, but it can also be unpredictable. And one night in the dark reminded me just how small and vulnerable you really are when you're out there alone. I had been a park ranger for almost 6 years, working in one of the more remote sections of the national forest, a stretch of land where few people ever wandered and even fewer stayed past sunset. That fall, the forest was dry and brittle, the kind of dryness that makes even seasoned rangers uneasy. The leaves on the trees had turned a muted golden brown, the kind that rustled sharply underfoot and seemed to crack louder than normal. I was alone that week, filling in for a coworker who had taken leave, and I had the entire backcountry section under my watch. I remember that night vividly. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the last streaks of light fading into a deep, cold blue. I was patrolling the North Ridge, where the trails twisted and forked into narrow deer paths, with my truck parked at a small clearing a couple of miles back. I had a thermos of coffee and my flashlight, and I had decided to hike a short way off the main trail to check a couple of fire lookout points. My radio crackled intermittently, but it was quiet. No other ranger was scheduled to check in until morning. As I moved up the ridge, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves and whispering through the pines in a way that sounded almost like distant voices. I kept my pace steady, focusing on the uneven ground, the roots and rocks jutting out of the soil. That's when I noticed the first odd thing, a patch of ground that looked recently disturbed. At first, I thought it might be an animal digging, maybe a raccoon or a coyote. But the imprint was too large, and the soil was not just dug but scattered, like something heavy had been dragged across it. My stomach tightened. I knelt to examine it. The tracks were deep, irregular, and wide. Not human, not quite any animal I could immediately identify. I took a photo with my phone, the flash barely illuminating the clearing, and then decided to continue, telling myself I was imagining things. I reached the lookout point and scanned the valley below with my binoculars. Everything seemed normal. The dark shapes of trees stretching into the distance, the faint silver of a creek reflecting the moonlight. But something about the silence didn't sit right. There were no sounds of nocturnal birds, no rustle of small mammals, just the wind and my own breathing. I started back down the ridge, flashlight beam bouncing across the trunks of the trees when I heard it. A faint crunch, then another. Something was moving parallel to me, in the underbrush just beyond the edge of the path. My dog, who had been with me until this week but was left home for this patrol, would have barked immediately. But I knew the sound of my own footsteps well, and these were deliberate, slow, heavy steps, not mine. My heartbeat picked up. I stopped, crouching slightly, and listened. The sound stopped too, like whatever it was had frozen in place. I kept moving, slower now, flashlight scanning every shadow. Then, in the distance, I caught a glimpse of something, a dark shape slipping between the trees, too large to be a deer, moving with purpose. I froze. My training kicked in. I knew not to chase, not to engage, and to maintain a safe distance while keeping the object in sight. I radio my location, my voice low, reporting nothing specific, just a patrol check-in. Silence. The signal must have been weak. I made the choice to head back to the truck, keeping the shape in sight. The terrain was tricky, and every step seemed louder than the last, every branch snapping underfoot like a gunshot. When I finally reached a point where I could see my truck's headlights gleaming faintly in the distance, I realized the shape had vanished. There was no sign of movement, no tracks beyond what I had seen earlier. I double-checked my surroundings, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. My chest was tight, and my mind was racing. By the time I got back to the truck, the forest felt heavier, oppressive, like it had been holding its breath the entire time. I locked the doors, sat for a moment, trying to calm myself, and then started the engine. Driving back down the narrow dirt road, I noticed something on the edge of the clearing I had passed earlier. A large branch had been broken, roughly at waist height, angled as if something had leaned against it. My stomach sank. I kept driving, checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the shape following. Nothing. By the time I reached the ranger station, dawn was breaking. The pale light washed over the forest, and for the first time, it looked ordinary again. I filed my report, including the photos of the tracks. By midday, I had contacted a wildlife biologist who came out to inspect the area. After examining the tracks, the disturbed soil, and the broken branch, they determined it was likely a large bear, an unusually large male that had been in the area, moving quietly and deliberately and avoiding human contact. The tracks confirmed it had passed right through the trail I had walked, unseen, keeping its distance but close enough to feel the presence. That experience stayed with me. I realized how easy it was to misjudge the forest at night, to feel like something was following, waiting. The fear wasn't in ghosts or myths. It was in knowing that in this vast wilderness, you are never truly alone. Nature itself can be terrifying, precise, and aware of you in ways you are not of it. I double-checked my gear that evening, updated protocols for night patrols, and learned to trust my instincts more than ever. From that point on, whenever I hiked alone at night, I moved differently. I kept my eyes and ears alert, my flashlight scanning constantly, and my radio on at all times. The bear never appeared again near the trail I patrolled, but I always remembered the quiet weight of those steps just behind me, the way the forest seemed to lean in, watching. It was a reminder that the wilderness is alive, patient, and can make a person feel very small, even when they're fully trained and navigated. I have been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, mostly patrolling the sprawling forests and canyons of the national park I was assigned to. Most days were routine, checking trails, inspecting campsites, dealing with lost hikers, or reporting down trees. But there was one night that still lingers in my mind, a night that made me reconsider how small we really are out in the wilderness. It was late August, one of the driest years the park had seen in decades. I was assigned a night patrol along a remote section of the park near a canyon that ran almost like a hidden artery through the forest. The trail there was narrow, unmarked in many areas, and the terrain was rough, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense undergrowth on the other. I was alone, my truck parked at the trailhead, and my flashlight, which I always carried, was my only companion besides the usual sound of the forest at night. I started on foot, as the trail was too rough for my vehicle. The first hour was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the rustle of dry leaves beneath my boots, the occasional snap of a branch from a nocturnal animal, and the whisper of wind through the tall pines. My senses were on alert. After years on the job, I knew how quickly things could change in the dark. About 2 hours into the patrol, I reached a section where the trail narrowed and the canyon dropped steeply to my left. I switched on my flashlight, sweeping the beam over the edge, scanning for anything unusual. That's when I saw it, an old, abandoned campsite clinging to the cliffside, barely visible in the moonlight. There were remnants of a fire ring, a collapsed tent, and an empty cooler, all weathered by months, maybe years, of exposure. Nothing about it screamed danger at first glance, but something about the site felt off. As I moved closer, my boot hit something hard in the dirt. I crouched and shined my flashlight on it. A small, rusted camping stove, still partially caked in ash. I shook my head. This campsite had clearly been deserted long ago, yet there was a sense that someone had been here more recently than the evidence suggested. The underbrush around the site was disturbed, footprints faint but visible. They weren't human size. They were smaller, like a child's, but the prints ended abruptly near the cliff's edge, as if whoever made them had vanished. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The forest was alive with the usual nighttime sounds, yet there was something different this time. A faint crunching noise from deeper in the trees, slow, deliberate, careful steps. My training told me to stay calm and assess, but instinct warned me this was not an animal. I grabbed my radio to call on my location, but the signal was weak. Static filled my ears, then silence. I decided to backtrack slowly, keeping my flashlight beam steady. The noise followed, echoing softly against the trees, never getting closer, never moving away. Each time I thought I'd reached the edge of the forested trail, I'd see a shadow flicker, just beyond the tree line, as if someone or something was watching me. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. Panic was dangerous out here. It made mistakes inevitable. About half a mile back down the trail, I reached a small clearing with a ridge I recognized. I had marked it on the park map as a safe observation point. I climbed onto a large boulder to get a better view and scanned the surrounding forest. That's when I saw it. The faint glow of a fire, small, almost imperceptible, down near the abandoned campsite. Someone had reignited it, or had been there very recently. The wind carried the smell of smoke, dry wood, and something else, metallic sharp like blood. I radio my location again. This time, the signal came through, and I requested backup immediately. While waiting, I kept my flashlight moving, try to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was down there. Minutes passed. The fire died, leaving only faint smoke rising into the night sky. No movement. The forest fell silent again, almost painfully so, as if it was holding its breath. When the backup finally arrived, we searched the area thoroughly. There were footprints, small and large, leading to and from the abandoned site, but no one was there. Nothing had been disturbed since I first found the site, except for the fire, which had burned only a few embers. The forest had returned to its normal rhythm, but the unease remained. Whoever had been there was gone, without a trace, leaving behind nothing but shadows and questions. I never found out who it was. Reports of missing people in that area had always been sporadic, mostly hikers who wandered off and were later found miles from their intended trails. I've been back to that section of the canyon many times, and I never see anything unusual again, but the memory stays with me. The forest is beautiful, but it's also indifferent, and out here in the darkness, alone, you realize how vulnerable you really are. That night reminded me that not everything in the wild can be explained, but the important part is returning safely. I made it back to my truck, exhausted, shaken, but alive. I filed my report, noting the footprints and the fire. The trail was quiet again, the forest reclaiming its secrets. Even now, when I patrol alone at night, I remember that canyon. I keep my senses sharper, my steps more deliberate, and I carry the reminder that sometimes in the wilderness, what you don't see is just as important and just as real as what you do. I remember the first time I realized just how isolated a forest could make you feel. I had been working as a park ranger in the northern part of Arizona for a little over a year, mostly patrolling remote trails and checking on campers and hikers. It was early October, the weather was crisp, and the leaves had started turning gold and rust. The sun dipped behind the ridges early in the evening, and the shadows of the pines stretched long across the forest floor. That day, I'd spent hours on foot, walking a trail that wound along a ridge I had never fully explored before. By late afternoon, I was several miles from any road or ranger station, and I had planned to head back before dark. But something made me pause when I reached a clearing that overlooked a steep canyon. The view was stunning, the kind of place that makes a person forget the time, but the quiet was unnerving. There was no wind, no birds, just the faint sound of a distant creek far below. I had parked my ranger truck at the trailhead hours ago, and now, looking around the clearing, I realized I was completely alone. My dog, a German shepherd named Jax, was at my side, alert but calm. I had trained him for tracking and search and rescue exercises, and I trusted his instincts, which usually meant a lot in situations like this. As I set down my backpack and checked my watch, I noticed a movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but Jack stiffened and let out a low whine, something he only did when he sensed danger. I squinted into the shadows between the trees and saw nothing at first, just a dark mass that seemed to shift slightly. I kept my flashlight in hand and stepped closer to the edge, scanning slowly, every sense alert. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 15. I lost track, but the movement continued. Not like a deer, not like any animal I had ever seen. It was irregular, slow, deliberate. My skin prickled as I felt the hairs on my neck rise. I had patrolled this forest in every season, through storms and late nights, but this was different. It was almost like someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I called Jax to me quietly, and he stayed close, ears forward, tail low, muscles tense. I debated retreating back to the trail, but my curiosity and training kept me rooted. As a ranger, I had to assess situations, identify threats, and sometimes confront the unexpected. Then I saw it clearly. A man, maybe in his late 30s, rugged and dirty, appearing out of the shadows between the pines. His clothes were torn, he had a scruffy beard, and his eyes were wide and dark, unblinking. My first instinct was to raise my flashlight and call out, but I caught myself. Something in his posture, the way he lingered at the edge of the clearing, told me this wasn't someone who wanted to be seen. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging, but I kept my hands free, not reaching for my sidearm just yet. I had been trained to observe first, assess, and act only when necessary. I watched him for a long moment. Then he moved, but not toward me. He stepped backward into the trees, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Jax growled low, a sound I had never heard from him directed at a human before. That's when I decided to leave. Slowly, I backed toward the trail, keeping my eyes on the shadows, every snapping twig making my pulse jump. The sun had disappeared completely behind the ridge, and the darkness was absolute, only my flashlight cutting through it. I reached my truck, feeling relief just seeing it parked exactly where I left it. Jax jumped in immediately, and I locked the doors behind us. The ride back to the ranger station was tense. Every rustle of leaves along the side of the road made me tense, but there was no sign of the man. I radioed in as soon as I got back, reporting a possible trespasser or someone lost in the area. A search team went out the next morning, combing the trails and canyons, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of camp, nothing at all. It was as if he had vanished into the forest entirely. I never saw that man again, but the experience stayed with me. I learned that night that the forest can hide people and things in ways you can't always explain. I also learned that sometimes the scariest moments aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about human presence in places you expect to be safe. From then on, I made sure never to patrol alone in areas I didn't know well, and I always kept my eyes and instincts sharp. That forest, beautiful and serene in the daylight, became a place I respected differently after that night. And Jax, ever alert, never let me forget that some dangers aren't obvious until they're right on the edge of your sight. The ending was clear. I survived without confrontation, reported what I saw, and learned from it. It wasn't a story of heroics or fights. It was a story about awareness, caution, and respect for the unpredictability of nature and people alike. Even now, whenever I walk that forest trail, I remember that night and move differently, slower, more deliberate, always watching. I had been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, working in the vast wilderness of northern Arizona. The forest there is dense, filled with ponderosa pines and steep, rocky ridges that drop into canyons so deep you can't see the bottom. I was used to being alone. Most of the time, I liked it. The quiet, the smell of pine, the occasional rustle of wildlife. It was calming. But there was one night, not long ago, that reminded me that being alone in the forest could also be terrifying in ways I wasn't prepared for. It was late October, the night's cold but not freezing yet. I had been patrolling a remote section of the park along a rarely used dirt road that led to an old fire lookout. The lookout itself was abandoned now. The metal staircase rusted and the windows thick with grime, but the view was incredible. From there, you could see miles of forest stretching into the horizon, the Mogollon Rim cutting sharply against the sky. I had parked my truck at the base of the trail and decided to hike up, flashlight in hand, to check the area for signs of illegal hunting or campers who might have wandered off trail. The hike was normal at first. The leaves underfoot were dry and crisp, breaking with a satisfying crunch as I climbed. The wind whispered through the trees, and occasionally I could hear the distant howl of a coyote. Nothing unusual. I reached the lookout around 9 p.m., set down my pack, and started inspecting the structure. That's when I noticed it. Faint footprints in the dirt near the base of the staircase. At first, I thought it might be a lost hiker or someone who had slipped off the main road. The prints were deep, clearly made by boots, and they headed up the trail I had just climbed. I called out softly, just in case someone was there, but there was no response. My voice seemed swallowed by the forest. I decided to follow the prints down a small side trail leading from the lookout, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trail was narrow and steep, and the further I went, the more I noticed the footprints changing. They became more erratic, sometimes large, sometimes small, and occasionally they circled back on themselves. Whoever, or whatever, had been here wasn't walking in a straight path. They were wandering, almost searching. My gut started to tighten. I had hiked this area countless times, and something about the footprints felt wrong. My training told me to stay calm, to observe, but instinct was screaming at me to leave. That's when I heard it, a snapping of twigs close by. I froze. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing at first. Then I caught movement just at the edge of the light. Something was shifting behind a thick cluster of bushes just off the trail. I crouched low, hand on my radio, ready to call for backup if I needed it. My dog, Ranger, who had been with me for years on patrols, stood silently beside me. Normally, he would bark at any strange presence, but this time he whimpered quietly, ears flat, tail down. I had never seen him like that. The rustling continued, slower now, deliberate. Whoever was moving with purpose, but staying just out of view. I followed the trail a little further, careful not to make noise. The prints led to a small clearing. That's when I saw them. An old campsite, long abandoned, but recently used. A few pieces of broken camping gear lay scattered. A tattered sleeping bag, an empty propane canister, a dented metal pot. The fire pit was cold, but had fresh ashes. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. The thought of someone living off the grid in this section of the park sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't illegal per se, but in this area, it was dangerous. People had died here before from exposure from wildlife. As I examined the site, I noticed something else, scratch marks on the nearby trees. Deep, jagged gouges, too high for an animal, placed almost as if to warn or mark territory. My heart rate quickened. This was no lost hiker. Whoever had been here was experienced, maybe even violent. I considered leaving immediately, but I had a responsibility to document this for the park files. I radioed the main station, quietly describing the scene. They advised me to retreat slowly and wait for backup before approaching the area. I did as they said, moving carefully back toward the main trail. That's when I heard again a low, deliberate rustle, not from the trees, but from the ground. Something large was moving behind the bushes. Ranger growled this time, low and tense. I shined a flashlight, but there was nothing, and then the sound stopped. Silence. I made it back to my truck without incident, adrenaline still pumping. I waited in the cab until the backup ranger arrived around 1 a.m. We returned to the clearing together the next morning, and the site was gone, completely erased like no one had been there in weeks. No footprints, no gear, no fire pit. The trees were intact, no scratches visible. It was as if someone had moved with extreme care to leave no trace. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. I filed my report. The park supervisors noted the location, but no one ever found any trace afterward. I didn't feel safe patrolling that section alone again. I stick to the main roads and trails now, and I always bring backup when I have to go into the deeper areas. That night taught me something important. The forest can feel calm and safe one moment, and completely unpredictable the next. Some things out there are real, and they don't need ghosts or monsters to be terrifying. Being a park ranger isn't just about rescuing hikers or putting out fires. Sometimes it's about witnessing the raw, untamed side of nature and knowing that it doesn't care about you or whether you're ready to see it. That night, I realized how thin the line is between quiet wilderness and something that can make your blood run cold. I never saw anyone, and maybe I never will, but the memory of that night is always with me, in every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, every distant howl in the forest. It's a reminder that some dangers aren't obvious, and that staying alert isn't just about duty, it's about survival. I have been a park ranger for just over 5 years, mostly patrolling the northern section of the forest reserve. That part of the park was dense and remote, with thick pine groves that blocked out sunlight even during the day. Most visitors never ventured far, sticking to the main trails, but I had to patrol the backcountry roads and hidden trails where there were no marked paths, no cell service, and often no sound except the wind and the occasional bird. That day started like any other late autumn morning. The air was cold, crisp, and dry, carrying the faint smell of pine needles and wet earth. I was checking a remote trail that ran along a small creek, a place rarely visited except by the occasional hiker or hunter. I drove slowly along the gravel road, the tires crunching against the loose stones. The radio was quiet, static more often than not, and I had no company except for my standard gear. First aid kit, flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and my old service rifle strapped to the back seat. The creek was my main checkpoint that morning, and I parked the truck in a small clearing near the water. I stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil, the ground still soft from early frost that hadn't fully melted. I checked the trail markers, noted their positions in my patrol log, and decided to follow the creek upstream for about half a mile to inspect a bridge that hadn't been checked in a few months. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was normal for late fall, but there was a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I moved, I noticed broken branches along the trail, deeper and more frequent than usual. Whoever, or whatever, had been moving through here recently had left very deliberate tracks. Human footprints. At first, I thought it was just a hiker, but the prints were too large and scattered, and there were no signs of backpacks or other debris. I felt a familiar tension in my chest, a warning instinct that years of patrolling this forest had ingrained. I kept moving, trying to stay calm. The trail narrowed, twisting around large boulders and fallen logs. I could hear the creek behind me, its water moving steadily, but faintly, as if something heavy was moving in it. I stopped suddenly when I saw the first sign that made my heart beat faster. A tree, just off the trail, had a rope tied around it, frayed and old, swinging slightly in the wind. That was not a normal mark for this forest. I stepped closer, examining it carefully, and saw faint stains on the ground near the base, dried blood, almost invisible in the shadows. I radioed into dispatch, keeping my voice calm, stating only that I had found something unusual near the creek trail. The static came back in response, but no one seemed alarmed. I moved slowly, my flashlight scanning the area even though it was still daylight. I followed the rope trail a little further and then found something that froze me completely, deep imprints in the mud that led off the trail into the trees, moving away from the creek. They were uneven, as if someone had been running or dragged something heavy. My stomach dropped, but my training kept me focused. I took careful notes and photographed everything with my phone, even though I knew the battery would run out fast. I followed the tracks cautiously, every sense alert. After about 20 minutes, I came across the source of the disturbance, a small clearing where a tarp had been set up as a makeshift shelter. There were no people around, but the ground was littered with empty food cans, plastic bottles, and scraps of cloth. What really got to me was the smell, stale, metallic, the unmistakable odor of someone or something having been injured here. I scanned the perimeter and noticed a large, deep hole in the ground near the far edge of the clearing, partially covered by leaves and branches. My heart sank further when I realized it was freshly dug. Whatever had been here had been hiding something or someone. I radioed again, this time with more urgency, describing the site and asking for backup. The response was a calm, "Copy, Unit 4. Backup is on the way, ETA 20 minutes. I didn't have 20 minutes. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't just abandon this. I stayed hidden near the trees, scanning every shadow. The forest seemed to close in around me, the wind dying down, and the only sounds were my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, footsteps, careful, deliberate, moving toward the clearing. I ducked lower behind a fallen log, gripping my rifle. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, ragged, moving slowly. It carried a large sack over its shoulder, stumbling slightly as if it was very heavy. I stayed still, heart hammering, waiting. The figure paused near the hole, dropped the sack, and disappeared briefly behind another cluster of trees. I could see the outline of something dark and heavy in the sack, moving slightly. I had never been so tense in my life. The sound of another vehicle in the distance made me feel slightly better. It was backup finally arriving, the engines echoing through the valley. The figure looked up, panicked, and ran. I followed cautiously, but didn't pursue too aggressively. Within minutes, 2 more rangers and a forest patrol SUV arrived. We secured the area and called in law enforcement. The tarp, the hole, and the sack were inspected carefully. Inside, we found evidence of a person who had been kidnapped and hidden here. The kidnapper had fled, leaving everything behind, but the victim was alive, just barely, and in urgent need of care. It was the closest I had ever been to real danger in the forest. The forest I had walked 1,000 times, the trails I had patrolled, suddenly felt unpredictable and raw. That night, as I sat back in my truck after the scene was cleared, I stared at the dark forest ahead. I had seen enough to know that danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be terrifying. It could just be human, unpredictable, and right in your own backyard. By dawn, law enforcement had taken over, and I returned to my routine patrols, but the memory stayed. Every time I walked those trails alone, I remembered the stillness, the frayed rope, and the hole in the ground. I learned that the forest doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your rank, your experience, or your training. It only cares about who is paying attention. And sometimes that alone is what keeps you alive. I have been a park ranger for just over 5 years, mostly patrolling the northern section of the forest reserve. That part of the park was dense and remote, with thick pine groves that blocked out sunlight, even during the day. Most visitors never ventured far, sticking to the main trails, but I had to patrol the backcountry roads and hidden trails where there were no marked paths, no cell service, and often no sound except the wind and the occasional bird. That day started like any other late autumn morning. The air was cold, crisp, and dry, carrying the faint smell of pine needles and wet earth. I was checking a remote trail that ran along a small creek, a place rarely visited except by the occasional hiker or hunter. I drove slowly along the gravel road, the tires crunching against the loose stones. The radio was quiet, static more often than not, and I had no company except for my standard gear. First aid kit, flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and my old service rifle strapped to the back seat. The creek was my main checkpoint that morning, and I parked the truck in a small clearing near the water. I stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil, the ground still soft from early frost that hadn't fully melted. I checked the trail markers, noted their positions in my patrol log, and decided to follow the creek upstream for about half a mile to inspect a bridge that hadn't been checked in a few months. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was normal for late fall, but there was a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I moved, I noticed broken branches along the trail, deeper and more frequent than usual. Whoever, or whatever, had been moving through here recently had left very deliberate tracks. Human footprints. At first, I thought it was just a hiker, but the prints were too large and scattered, and there were no signs of backpacks or other debris. I felt a familiar tension in my chest, a warning instinct that years of patrolling this forest had ingrained. I kept moving, trying to stay calm. The trail narrowed, twisting around large boulders and fallen logs. I could hear the creek behind me, its water moving steadily, but faintly, as if something heavy was moving in it. I stopped suddenly when I saw the first sign that made my heart beat faster. A tree, just off the trail, had a rope tied around it, frayed and old, swinging slightly in the wind. That was not a normal mark for this forest. I stepped closer, examining it carefully, and saw faint stains on the ground near the base. Dried blood, almost invisible in the shadows. I radioed into dispatch, keeping my voice calm, stating only that I had found something unusual near the creek trail. The static came back in response, but no one seemed alarmed. I moved slowly, my flashlight scanning the area, even though it was still daylight. I followed the rope trail a little further, and then found something that froze me completely. Deep imprints in the mud that led off the trail into the trees, moving away from the creek. They were uneven, as if someone had been running or dragged something heavy. My stomach dropped, but my training kept me focused. I took careful notes and photographed everything with my phone, even though I knew the battery would run out fast. I followed the tracks cautiously, every sense alert. After about 20 minutes, I came across the source of the disturbance, a small clearing where a tarp had been set up as a makeshift shelter. There were no people around, but the ground was littered with empty food cans, plastic bottles, and scraps of cloth. What really got to me was the smell, stale, metallic, the unmistakable odor of someone or something having been injured here. I scanned the perimeter and noticed a large, deep hole in the ground near the far edge of the clearing, partially covered by leaves and branches. My heart sank further when I realized it was freshly dug. Whatever had been here had been hiding something or someone. I radioed again, this time with more urgency, describing the site and asking for backup. The response was a calm, "Copy, Unit 4. Backup is on the way, ETA 20 minutes. I didn't have 20 minutes. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't just abandon this. I stayed hidden near the trees, scanning every shadow. The forest seemed to close in around me, the wind dying down, and the only sounds were my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, footsteps, careful, deliberate, moving toward the clearing. I ducked lower behind a fallen log, gripping my rifle. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, ragged, moving slowly. It carried a large sack over its shoulder, stumbling slightly, as if it was very heavy. I stayed still, heart hammering, waiting. The figure paused near the hole, dropped the sack, and disappeared briefly behind another cluster of trees. I could see the outline of something dark and heavy in the sack, moving slightly. I had never been so tense in my life. The sound of another vehicle in the distance made me feel slightly better. It was backup finally arriving, the engines echoing through the valley. The figure looked up, panicked, and ran. I followed cautiously, but didn't pursue too aggressively. Within minutes, 2 more rangers and a forest patrol SUV arrived. We secured the area and called in law enforcement. The tarp, the hole, and the sack were inspected carefully. Inside, we found evidence of a person who had been kidnapped and hidden here. The kidnapper had fled, leaving everything behind, but the victim was alive, just barely, in an urgent need of care. It was the closest I had ever been to real danger in the forest. The forest I had walked 1,000 times, the trails I had patrolled, suddenly felt unpredictable and raw. That night, as I sat back in my truck after the scene was cleared, I stared at the dark forest ahead. I had seen enough to know that danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be terrifying. It can just be human, unpredictable, and right in your own backyard. By dawn, law enforcement had taken over, and I returned to my routine patrols, but the memory stayed. Every time I walked those trails alone, I remembered the stillness, the frayed rope, and the hole in the ground. I learned that the forest doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your rank, your experience, or your training. It only cares about who is paying attention. And sometimes that alone is what keeps you alive.